It would be incredible to enter that game you have always played and know practically inside and out, especially knowing there are countless powers and that you could become incredibly strong. Sounds great, doesn't it? But when Kang Jioma received a system, he was not nearly as happy as expected. After all, the blessing he gained felt more like torture. To control that power, he had to push himself harder and harder with each passing day. The worst part was realizing that, little by little, he was losing control. Gradually, he was becoming something further and further removed from being human. He seemed more like a blade thirsting for blood than an actual person. Want to find out just how far this story will go? Edited by RotoVT. Today, Kang Jioma remembered his past life, especially when he played the dating simulator section involving Saki. As expected, she liked the protagonist. After all, that part of the game was designed precisely as a dating simulator. Because of that, Kang Jioma asked whether she liked Leon. She looked disappointed by the question and replied that she was still holding on to some hope. Kang Jioma was confused. He was certain he remembered that part correctly. His memory could not be wrong, so something must have changed. That was why he asked whether it might be Apple. She lost her patience and struck him hard on the head. Later, Kang Jioma rubbed his head, wondering how Markira could hit so hard. At least he was fine. When he checked the system, he noticed several improvements. His martial aptitude had reached level 6, probably thanks to Mansur's Eternal Jade. After that dream, synchronization had also risen to 24.7%, though he did not know whether that would be good or bad. Even so, everything suggested there was a direct connection to the Sword God's protection. It was already late and completely dark. The festival was drawing to an end while he remained away from everyone else. Magic and monsters existed freely in that world, yet he did not find it all that different from Earth. He did not miss his previous life much either, since his master had practically been his only human connection. Even so, that only lasted while Kang Jioma still had something to learn about the sword. Afterward, his master simply left him to continue alone. Back then, he was young and furious because he could not understand why. Only after traveling through the 8 provinces in pursuit of becoming the best in the country did he realize that adapting to variables mattered even more than mastering techniques. No training could surpass a real battle filled with tension. After all, few things could teach as much as first-hand experience. He then concluded that the academy and that man were alike. Both valued practical experience above everything else. Suddenly, however, he noticed something moving in the darkness and sensed a faint trace of magical power. Perhaps another villain had infiltrated the academy. Without hesitation, he drew his knife and activated the Sword God's protection. His perception changed, allowing him to see everything as a hologram resembling an architectural blueprint of the area. That was when he clearly noticed a shadow moving behind him. He reacted instantly and landed a direct blow on the disguised instructor, striking her in the stomach. She quickly explained that she had come to propose a deal. Kang Jioma knew perfectly well that she was a villain. After all, he had already noticed her watching him ever since the Buffalo Dungeon. She revealed herself as Choi Sol, who had infiltrated the academy as an instructor and begged to be spared. When asked about the hidden villains, she explained that they constantly changed their appearances while retaining their identities, so she did not know their exact number. He realized that she was genuinely revealing every piece of information she had simply to ensure her own survival. Most surprising of all, some villains knew that he had defeated Corey, even after the Sword Emperor had ordered absolute silence regarding the matter. He then asked why they were blaming Leon for her death. Choi Sol replied that she knew nothing about it. When he showed the knife again, she insisted that she was telling the truth. Among the villains was someone called Professor, who was responsible for nearly all their plans. Compared with him, Choi Sol held a much lower position. Choi Sol realized that the boy was even more unpredictable than she had imagined. Staying there was dangerous, but going back would certainly put her life at risk. Kang Jioma concluded that she was probably telling the truth. He then asked Choi Sol whether she wanted to switch to his side. She immediately lowered her head, accepting and begging for the opportunity. In response, he laid down 2 conditions. First, he wanted to discover who Professor was and demanded that she reveal absolutely everything she knew about him. She explained that Professor was the subordinate of a demon, but she knew little beyond that. As far as she knew, his name was Mr. Quorn. Kang Jioma immediately recognized the name. Quorn commanded the 2nd Demon Legion and had taken control of the army after Licon was sealed. Discovering that one of that demon's subordinates had infiltrated the academy was unexpected. Choi Sol explained that none of the other villains knew Professor's true identity. Perhaps that was why his reputation among them was so poor. After assessing Choi Sol, Jioma realized that she had lost her standing among the villains. She had little magical power left, and with her weak physical abilities, she had probably always relied on magic. She did not seem like a genuine threat. He remembered that this choice was still dangerous, since his life had already been threatened several times. It could hardly be called a deal. Choi Sol replied that the demon who had died was to blame. Kang Jioma pressured her again, making it clear that if she gave him what he wanted, she could stay alive. Confused, she asked what exactly he was talking about. That was when he acted. Kang Jioma made a small cut, but not directly on her. His target was something attached to Choi Sol's body. When a contract is formed with a demon of the magical race that commands a legion, two seals appear. Each represents half of the symbol belonging to the subordinate demon. The commander keeps the seal that transmits magical power, while the villain receives the receiving seal. Since Cory was dead, the symbol on Choi Sol's body was now nothing more than a useless receiver. Kang Jeoma knew this well because he had once been a user of that system. The receiving seal contained part of the villain's life force and essentially functioned like a collar. Choi Sol's startled reaction immediately confirmed that his conclusion was correct. He then made it clear that, from that day onward, she would work as his informant. Later, Kang Jeoma concluded that Choi Sol would do practically anything to survive. That made her a useful informant. He could deal with her situation properly later. At that moment, Saki sent a message asking where he was. Kang Jeoma simply replied that he had gone to the bathroom and was already heading back. She seemed ready to end the conversation, but something happened before she could send her next message. It was at that exact moment that the fireworks began. Naturally, everyone was captivated by the spectacle. After all, that festival symbolized hope for all of them. Saki merely asked if he could see the fireworks. He lied and said he could not, even though he could, so she asked for ice cream as compensation. With regular classes resuming, no one seemed particularly excited, especially Speed Weapon. Saki, meanwhile, was sleeping on her desk. Chloe was completely focused on watching a fly. Speed Weapon complained, wondering why those exams covered so much material. He said they were completely ignoring students' rights. Saki told him to be quiet. He told her to sleep in a bed, but she replied that she would sleep wherever she wanted. Speed Weapon remarked that they still had to memorize everything, but she replied that she had already mastered all the material on the exam. He then declared that this time he would finally surpass her. Just then, the fly landed on his face, and Chloe ended up giving him a solid slap. When Chloe realized what she had just done, she immediately apologized. Shortly afterward, everyone unexpectedly received a message from the academy. It was an announcement regarding the practical exam at the end of the first semester. Due to unavoidable circumstances, the final practical exam had been changed. It would now be a team competition in an external dungeon located in the academy's special pavilion. Each group would have one second-year student and two first years chosen at random. Speed Weapon was surprised and asked whether they had really changed the exam with only 3 days remaining. Originally, the exam was simply supposed to involve clearing a dungeon full of goblins in Gapyong. He had been looking forward to gathering some materials there. Things were taking a different turn. Thinking about it, perhaps this was only natural. Even though he knew the events ahead, he might have already lost the advantages granted by his game experience and the miracle's blessing through his own actions. If things continued this way, he would no longer be able to anticipate what would happen from that point onward. Saki asked why he looked so nervous. She was also surprised by the change to the exam, but she did not consider it completely impossible. During the last midterm exam, even the Sword Emperor ended up injured. Problems always arose during outdoor training, so the academy was probably the best place to keep everyone safe. He admitted that she was right. Thanks to her words, he was finally able to organize his thoughts. She asked him to stop staring at her like that. After all, if even he was confused, it was easy to imagine how everyone else felt. If the president of the travel club lost his composure, the other members would become uneasy as well. Kang Jeoma thought she truly failed to notice certain things. Meanwhile, she thought he was far too slow to understand. He then asked her for a favor and wondered if she still had the employee list obtained when she hacked into the academy's system. Saki explained that she had deleted the digital copy to avoid being traced, but had kept another version. It was a printed copy. He said that would make things much easier and asked her to hack into the academy's network just one more time. After she explained the entire situation, Chloe was surprised to learn that villains had infiltrated the academy. During the dungeon incident, they had even attacked the Sword Demon's army. Jomana was certain of it, but the villains constantly changed their appearances. Saki then asked if he wanted an updated list so they could compare it with the previous one. He confirmed it. Everyone knew that the club had been created specifically to provide protection. If there were people capable of becoming threats in the future, it would be better to identify them in advance. Speed Weapon wanted to ask several more questions, but for the time being, he decided to follow the leader's instructions. The others agreed, and Kang Jeoma concluded that this should be enough for now. Saki explained that the academy's faculty and staff records were automatically updated every month. Apparently, the data was stored both in the cloud and in a subspace. Kang Jeoma understood that Saki was unfamiliar with the method because she belonged to that world. It was an optimization that periodically reduced fictional data, something common there and useful for his gaming experience. He asked Saki if it was possible. She confidently replied that nothing was impossible. Even so, she asked if he did not think he was taking too much advantage of her. He realized she was right. Until then, he had been using the fact that they belonged to the same club as justification. In the end, he had placed far too much work on her shoulders. The problem was that he did not know what he could do for Saki either. After all, what could he possibly offer the daughter of Japan's lifelong prime minister? So he asked what she would like in return. Saki paused for a moment to think. In the end, she said he could simply do her a small favor later. By the next day, she had already finished all the necessary paperwork. Everything had been printed, and the digital data had already been erased to eliminate any possibility of being traced. Kang Jioma knew she could handle this sort of thing when necessary, but he was still impressed. Speed Weapon, on the other hand, asked whether this was really acceptable. He was even more shocked when he realized there were records of the employees' trips to the restroom. He wondered whether anyone had any privacy there and said that even if they were searching for a villain, this was still illegal. She replied that it had already been illegal from the first time she hacked into the system and called him an idiot. He argued that even this needed limits. She replied that he was being far too moralistic. Kang Jioma explained that in this case, the more information they had, the better, even details that seemed insignificant. He also promised that once their work was finished, they would destroy all the material. They began examining all the paperwork, dividing the tasks among themselves quite efficiently. Chloe was an assassin, while Saki adapted her methods according to her objectives. For both of them, the boundaries of morality seemed somewhat flexible. Kang Jioma still could not fully understand Sanhana. Speed Weapon at least maintained a basic level of common sense. He explained that there was approximately 1 week left before vacation. During the final exams, the travel club would begin searching for the villain. He then asked whether anyone still had any doubts. Sanhana said she had heard something before arriving there and asked where that information had come from. Speed Weapon commented that he had intended to ask about it the previous day but had forgotten. According to her, the data came from someone willing to do anything the president asked. Kang Jioma realized she had brought up exactly the subject he wanted to avoid. He could not reveal his secret contact with Choi Sol, much less say that they were searching for Leon. Doing so would only cause new misunderstandings and further increase the number of things he would need to explain. Above all, if Chloe discovered the truth, Choi Sol, who possessed no magical power, could end up in danger. He merely replied that he could not reveal anything yet, but assured them that the source was reliable. When the right time came, he would tell them who his informant was. No one pressed the matter further. Even so, Sanhana continued looking at him with a hint of suspicion. Kang Jioma thought it was truly difficult to figure out what was going through her mind. Sanhana reminded him of someone, but he simply could not identify who. He had that feeling as well. She looked remarkably similar to a certain person who had the same hair color and, strangely enough, also wore round glasses. But who could it be? Joao Matisse then announced that they could begin the travel club's first meeting. After working for quite a while, Chloe came over and handed him a bottle of water. For some reason, she seemed a little discouraged. Meanwhile, Speed Weapon and Saki were discussing another report they had received. Kang Jioma told Chloe not to worry so much. Saki and Epon naturally enjoyed that kind of task, while she could do things they could not, both in the dungeon and during the festival. She grew completely embarrassed by the compliment and said she wished she could be in the same group as him for this exam. The information soon arrived. Kang Jioma was placed in a group with Sam, Sanhana, and Rachel, who would be the leader. Rachel immediately sent him a message saying they were together again. He became even more disappointed. Chloe complained that it had to be that girl, or rather, that blonde, while Speed Weapon pointed out that at least it was someone they knew. Sanhana was also part of the group, so theoretically nothing should go wrong. That being the case, worrying about the boss would be completely pointless. Sanhana assured them that she would keep an eye on him to prevent him from getting distracted. Saki said she had been grouped with Ariel from the second-year hang class, and Leon would be the team leader. Dilma remained silent for a few moments, causing everyone else to fall quiet. Then he simply suggested they call it a day. However, when Saki and Sanhana were left alone in the room, shortly before Sanhana was about to leave, Saki asked why her name appeared on the staff list, who she really was, and what she was hiding. She pointed out that Sanhana always acted remarkably calm. Her words and actions seemed calculated, and she never tried to force her own opinion on anyone. All of that had always seemed very strange, so Saki asked whether she should actually be calling her Professor Sanhana. Sanhana merely laughed and asked whether Saki was taking that suspicion a little too far. After all, getting things mixed up like that did not seem like her. The problem was that the document indicated Sanhana was currently on an international trip. Saki believed she would never overlook a detail like that. The information was automatically updated by the subspace system and could not be tampered with. External access to the subspace system was an authority reserved exclusively for the Academy director. That raised the possibility that the director herself was involved. Sanhana said anyone could make mistakes. After all, she was not a machine. She did not know how things were in Japan, but in Korea many people shared the same name. Perhaps Saki was tense because she had seen it right after the meeting. In any case, since everything was merely a misunderstanding that had already been cleared up, Sanhana decided to leave. Saki remained there, irritated, wondering whether she had overlooked some important detail. Before leaving, Sanhana decided to offer some advice as someone older. Slow men like Kang Jioma rarely notice anything unless you make your intentions clear. She should make her feelings obvious. Sanhana added that she was rooting for her. Saki could not understand where that had suddenly come from. At 5040 in the morning, Kang Jioma was already awake, lost in thought. He did not care much about the changes to the exam, but of all people, Rachel had become the group leader. As if he did not already have enough problems, he now had another concern. Once again, he had ended up in the same main group as the person he found hardest to deal with. As a player, he knew Rachel's advances did not come from affection, but from her desire to secure a strong bloodline. Ironically, in the dating simulator, she still possessed the old maid trait. That was precisely why Rachel was one of the hardest characters to win over. On top of that, her original target was Lee. Deep down, he simply and sincerely hoped everything would turn out well. It was at that exact moment that he received a call from Saki. She asked whether he was still awake. Kang Jioma replied that he had simply woken up earlier than usual. Saki said she could not sleep for very long either. He was still trying to figure out why she had called so early and so suddenly. She asked whether he thought she only contacted him whenever there was a problem. Thinking about it, she did have a point. Saki usually handled important matters verbally and rarely communicated through messages alone. Even so, that sudden call still felt unusual. She then explained that she had only called to wish him good luck on the exam. Kang Jioma wished her luck as well. Saki thanked him and ended the call shortly afterward. The sun was beginning to rise. Kang Jioma then finished getting ready. From the outside, the place looked like an ordinary building, yet there was something strangely different about its atmosphere. He was inside the Academy's special pavilion. It contained a space created by the founder, Valor Joachim, to recreate the 20 years he had survived in Jihen. It was essentially a smaller version of the demon world, complete with its own ecosystem, even containing rocks and weeds transplanted from there. At least they had not placed magical beasts inside. The place was supposedly designed for real combat, but Kang Jioma still was not accustomed to taking an exam in that kind of environment. The moment he arrived, Rachel immediately rushed toward him. Kang Jioma was already about to draw his knife when she recoiled in surprise and asked what he was doing. Rachel remarked that his bad boy aura seemed even stronger than the last time. To her, that was precisely part of his charm. It was no surprise that every girl ended up captivated by him. Kang Jioma then noticed that Sanhana at least was already there. She was equipped with her B-class weaponry, a weapon with a rather unusual appearance. He asked whether that really was her weapon and immediately realized the situation was going to be complicated. Sanhana formally introduced herself to Rachel and said she hoped the two of them would work well together. Rachel cheerfully replied that of course everything would go well. Kang Jioma, however, could only think about how frighteningly skilled Sanhana was at handling people. Once everyone had arrived, an instructor climbed the stairs and began explaining. The first-year final exam would take place in the special pavilion and would be a team competition, although it worked somewhat differently. The rules were simple. Each team had to pass through the portal and reach the designated checkpoint within 1 hour. Those who arrived before the deadline would advance, while everyone else would be disqualified. Some students thought it sounded simple. They only had to run to the destination. Kang Jioma, however, knew that an ordinary race to see who arrived first would hardly qualify as a real exam. The instructor continued, explaining that there would be no magical beasts, but the environment recreated the demon realm of Garena. Since there was no protection from the subspace barrier, the students needed to be especially careful. The students began wondering why they needed to be so cautious if there were no magical beasts. Some guessed that perhaps breathing in that environment would be difficult. An instructor called for silence and explained that despite their young age, everyone carried weapons and serious accidents could happen. For that reason, using weapons during the final exam was prohibited. Kang Jioma concluded that it would be a race against time through that artificial environment. It seemed fairer than the midterm exam, although he still did not know how everything would be evaluated without subspace intervention. The chief instructor explained that each group would have an instructor responsible for scoring and preventing incidents. If anyone wanted to withdraw during the exam, they only needed to inform the person in charge. With that, the explanation ended. The instructors were assigned among the groups, and one of them ended up being placed with Joao's team. Rachel and Sanhana's group was assigned to instructor Choi Sol, who looked terrified when she saw Kang Jioma. Rachel found her reaction strange and asked whether she knew Jioma or had sensed something. She explained that she did not know him personally, but every instructor knew about his performance. After all, Instructor Kim had been responsible for that group during the exam. Deep down, she thought she might lose her mind. She had been stuck with those two troublemakers, and even with the stolen demonic seal, she still had to do her job. She remarked that no matter how beautiful she was, she would feel embarrassed if they kept staring. Rachel, however, said she looked like a potato. The instructor shot back that having large breasts did not make someone beautiful, then even started criticizing her hair. The two nearly started arguing right there, student against instructor. That Choi Sol truly took her role as the group's supervisor seriously. Choi Sol told them to stop fooling around. As the instructor in charge, she was responsible not only for preventing accidents but also for evaluating their scores. Kang Jioma then remarked that they should get moving, since the exam had already begun. Rachel, however, made it clear that she did not like her. Sometime later, she already looked completely exhausted in that place. Still repeating that she disliked the instructor, they reached Gate 1 of artificial Garena, known as the Wasteland Desert. Rachel asked what kind of instructor walked in front instead of keeping watch from behind. Choi Sol explained that she had been excited at first, but with magical power flowing all around them, she could barely concentrate. Kang Jioma realized that the environment truly was not normal. Following Choi Sol, they advanced through the portal as soon as the first gate opened. For some reason, he was still perfectly fine. Rachel, on the other hand, looked exhausted, perhaps because she was more sensitive to magical power. Choi Sol remained full of energy, probably thanks to her strong magical affinity. Jioma considered the possibility of a conspiracy, but nothing seemed suspicious. Besides, with the demonic seal, she was unlikely to try anything. He asked whether Sanhana was all right. She said it was exhausting but bearable, and noted that he looked perfectly fine. Jioma replied that he only felt a strange tingling sensation on his skin. Surprised, she asked if it was really just a tingling sensation. Jioma realized that Sanhana did not have particularly strong magical affinity either. Even though she belonged to the club, he still distrusted her. According to Choi Sol, villains and infiltrators had progressed farther than expected. Sanhana did not seem to be pretending, but without his knife, Jioma preferred to keep watching her. For now, he decided to wait and asked Rachel how much time had passed since they entered the first gate. Rachel had not been keeping track, but Sanhana said that 25 minutes had already passed. Jioma realized their margin was smaller than he had expected, leaving them only 35 minutes. The two of them were already in terrible condition and were even having trouble finding their bearings. Continuing like that would only waste time. Jioma did not want to be disqualified without even fighting, especially since he still did not know what the reward would be. If only he had his knife, he could expand his sensory range and use it to locate magical power. The problem was that all the weapons were in Choi Sol's custody. Then he realized there was still something else he could try, since he possessed the demonic seal. He could turn Choi Sol into a kind of magical power tracker. Not long afterward, Choi Sol truly looked like a tracking hound, carefully following the traces of magical energy. Rachel also began walking normally again, using her own strength to crush the intense magical pressure surrounding her. As for Jioma, he seemed to be growing more accustomed to the environment with every passing moment. The instructor remarked that it was impressive and that things truly changed in an unusual environment. Even Sanhana seemed to be recovering. Then she asked what Kang Jioma's secret was for remaining so calm. He began answering, keeping the conversation casual. While they talked, they took advantage of the moment to act without drawing attention. She moved closer and whispered that she could sense magical power coming from the northwest. If they followed that direction for about 10 minutes, they would reach the first checkpoint. Jioma praised her work, and Choi Sol replied that she was not some little puppy. He merely thought that it was already helping a great deal. Thanks to that, at least the group was making excellent progress. Jioma also began wondering how the other participants were doing. 32 minutes after the exam began, Leon's group was also moving at a fairly reasonable pace. Leon told them they were already close to the first checkpoint and suggested picking up the pace a little. However, the other girl in the group, who was not Saki, asked for a few minutes to rest because she could no longer keep up. Saki tried to encourage her, saying they were almost there and that she only needed to endure a little longer. Ariel, however, began coughing repeatedly, showing that she was completely exhausted. Saki asked Leon to wait because Ariel was struggling to keep up. He, however, asked why that should matter. Saki said he was being insensitive and rude. Leon replied that he was not ignoring her, but as the group's leader, he had certain responsibilities to fulfill. She could interpret his words however she wanted. Even so, Leon had no intention of carrying members who were incapable of trusting him and following his instructions. After all, he did not know much about the dynamics of the travel club she belonged to. Leon then approached and warned her not to expect him to act like her dear friend Kang Jioma. Saki asked what Jioma had to do with any of this. Leon explained that he simply would not be as considerate as Jioma. Ariel then reassured Saki and apologized for holding the group back. The instructor remarked that some arguments brought people closer and that leaders carried a great deal of pressure. He asked them to put in more effort, while Saki continued wondering how Kang Jioma was doing. Meanwhile, Kang Jioma asked the instructor why they still had not encountered any other students. Rachel asked whether someone would show up for a little confrontation, but Choi Sol explained that it worked like the training they had done on the survival island. Each group started from a different location. Furthermore, the subspace only functioned up to the entrance. Kang Jioma asked whether everyone had the same checkpoint. If their destination really was the same, he imagined they should have encountered another group by now. The instructor said she would not be surprised if someone had given up along the way. Rachel complained that she only wanted an exam where she could fight the other students directly. Jioma thought his group probably would have been eliminated as well if they had not had Choi Sol's help. He then asked the instructor how participants who gave up midway managed to return. She pulled a mana device from her bag. Pressing the red button would immediately transmit their location to the administration office's screen. Jioma asked why the subspace did not interfere with that technology. Choi Sol replied that he was far too curious and jokingly asked whether he knew what happened to curious people. In the end, she admitted that she did not understand much about it either. She had heard it was an educational device created by the Hero Association's laboratory using remnants of an artifact. The subspace bag also came from the association. Kang Jioma reflected reflected that artifacts possessed unknown powers and were practically impossible to value. Only 10 existed in the entire world, all considered national treasures of immense importance to Korea. Not even a single country could possess one exclusively. For that reason, the Hero Association directly managed these artifacts to preserve the balance among nations. She wondered whether they would really hand out a version of something like that. Thinking about it, that did not seem like a very good idea. Choi Sol told him not to even consider it. If he lost that artifact, he would have to cover the damages out of his own pocket. Kang Jeoma found it amusing to hear such an ordinary concern coming from a villain like her. She assured them there was no need to worry. As long as she remained there, nothing bad would happen. That was when Rachel finally spotted the checkpoint. Diago replied that he had only spotted the place. At least now they would not end up getting lost. The instructor recorded 48 minutes and 24 seconds for Rachel's group to complete the first gate. As soon as the second gate began, she would start the 1-hour timer again. Soon afterward, everyone stood before the second gate, a completely isolated door in the middle of nowhere. Choi Sol whispered into Kang Jeoma's ear that it was also her first time there. She was confused because this definitely did not look like an ordinary checkpoint. It was not merely a simple door. The magical power emanating from it was intense enough to distort space itself. Rachel noticed there was absolutely nothing behind the door. Although she found it strange, she concluded that they only needed to open it and pass through. The instructor simply repeated what she had already explained. The instant they entered, the timer would begin counting down. Rachel could hardly believe it, but since she was the leader, she decided to open the door. Despite her concern, she assumed nothing too serious could happen. The moment she opened the door, however, she suddenly plunged toward the abyss. Fortunately, Sanhana managed to grab her before she fell. Rachel complained that she had nearly suffered an accident. Choi Sol explained that she had never been there either, and therefore knew nothing about the danger. Even so, she confirmed that this was the second gate and had already started the timer. This was the second gate of the artificial Garena, known as the Abyss Bridge. The magical power spread throughout the area seemed to originate from the murky water beneath the bridge. Kang Jeoma finally understood why they had encountered no one along the way. Instructors had been stationed there under the pretext of ensuring safety and evaluating the students. Even so, the very structure of the test made many students consider giving up first. Without knowing the correct answer, they had no choice but to face some degree of risk. Meanwhile, Leon's group was already advancing along the edge of the bridge. Saki remarked that Leon did not hesitate at all and simply kept moving forward. The instructor realized that Leon seemed to possess an exceptional ability to detect magical power. Elsewhere, several members of another group were in terrible condition. Some could barely remain standing. They were members of the group led by Abel, and they were already nearing their limits. They had reached the second gate, but Abel realized he could no longer force the others to continue. For that reason, Abel von Nibelung, as the group's leader, decided to formally request withdrawal. The instructor stopped the timer, recording yet another team eliminated from the exam. Speed Weapon was also in the lobby and looked terrible. He even threw up the pizza he had eaten for breakfast. Then again, pizza first thing in the morning probably did not help much. Leave a like if you think pizza for breakfast is a good idea. If you think it is terrible, you can leave a like too. And leave a comment if you enjoyed the return of this series because many people had been asking for it. We waited for chapters to build up since the publication went on hiatus after an arc ended and remained paused for quite some time. Now we are finally back. I hope you enjoyed the video, so let us continue the story. Chloe found Speed Weapon and called him Smoke. She explained that her group had exceeded the time limit at the first checkpoint. His group was eliminated after walking in circles. Then she mentioned that Kang Jeoma and Saki still had not returned. Speed Weapon said there was no need to worry about the boss. His real concern was something else. He was worried about Saki precisely because she was in the same group as Leon. Leon was a prodigy who had appeared out of nowhere. His appearance, behavior, and social skills seemed flawless. He was like a blank sheet of paper, capable of absorbing any nearby influence, whether positive or negative. Speed Weapon and Apple believed they were fine. They then suggested helping hunt the villains since they had been eliminated early. Chloe remarked that Smoke was becoming more like Kang Jeoma, making him wonder why she always got his name wrong. In any case, they continued onward, descending along the path until they reached the bridge. Before long, they found themselves face to face with that enormous abyss. Rachel finally gathered her courage and lunged forward, practically leaning against her companion's back. He remarked that the two of them seemed to have grown much closer recently. Sanhana observed that this was the checkpoint bridge and wondered whether all they really had to do was cross it. Before them stood a damaged bridge stretching toward a distant tower. This time, at least, the objective seemed fairly obvious. Even so, anyone would hesitate when faced with a situation like that. Since there was no direct interference within the subspace, even Kang Jeoma felt somewhat uncertain about crossing. Choi Sol explained that the magical power came from the lake, making the situation even more suspicious. Jeoma then asked why the instructor herself did not cross first. Kang Jeoma figured that would not be considered cheating since no one was directly watching them. He had already used Choi Sol to test dangers before, so he could simply use the same method again. He remembered that the instructors were there precisely to prevent accidents. In that case, it made perfect sense for her to go ahead of them. Choi Sol replied that directly interfering with the exam could cause problems for her. Kang Jioma said he would take full responsibility. Rachel immediately agreed, and Sanhana supported the idea as well. Joyce merely commented that she was afraid of heights. At that moment, Kang Jioma contacted Choi Sol through the seal. Through telepathic communication, he ordered her to cross first. In exchange, he promised to give her practically anything she wanted, except for the demonic seal. Choi Sol remembered that he had indeed made that promise. She then told the students that she would ensure their safety and slowly began crossing the bridge. After testing the path, she said it seemed sturdy and told them to move forward, although crossing it was difficult for her. After reaching a certain point, she stopped and admitted that she could not continue any farther. Rachel remarked that the instructor was acting like a little child. Kang Jioma replied that, at the very least, she had helped the group move forward and acknowledged that she had done a good job. She became as excited as a puppy being petted. Even so, she kept walking and told him that he could trust her. Rachel asked what had happened and whether he had bribed that woman. He replied that he did not even have enough money for that. Even so, Rachel continued ahead and ended up turning it into a kind of race against the instructor. Sanhana remarked that the two of them really were alike, and he knew perfectly well that the competition had started because of him. He remained silent, trying to understand what had just happened. Meanwhile, Leon had already reached the third gate, the Tower of Garina's trial. The group continued climbing an enormous staircase, advancing toward the light. Leon realized that he still had not encountered any other students. First place seemed practically guaranteed, but he could not understand why the path was so long. The instructor asked everyone to hold on just a little longer, since they were almost at their destination. Ariel, however, was already at her limit. She could barely keep walking. She asked Leon whether he realized who was coming behind him and told him to slow down a little. Leon coldly replied that it was their problem if they could not keep up with him. As expected, everyone was quite surprised by his response. Soon afterward, he apologized. He said he was tired and irritated as well, and since they were already on the 5th floor, they could rest for a while. She was surprised and wondered where that sudden change in attitude had come from. Leon said he could inspect the 5th floor alone while the others climbed at their own pace. However, Ariel could not continue. She dropped to her knees, completely lacking the strength to take another step. The instructor still tried to encourage her, but the situation was already becoming difficult. Saki told Ariel to climb onto her back. She said those who still had strength should help those who could no longer continue, then told her to hurry before she changed her mind. Saki did not look very well either, and had clearly been affected quite badly. Who would have imagined that she would push herself so hard for someone else? Ariel accepted the help and climbed onto her back. Saki joked that for someone so thin, she was surprisingly heavy. It was then that everyone suddenly sensed something strange about the place. Kang Jioma noticed an unusual presence coming from inside the tower. When Kang Jioma, Rachel, and the others entered the tower, he felt a sense of foreboding. Perhaps his senses really had become a little sharper, or perhaps it was merely his imagination. The instructor took the lead and the group moved forward. Kang Jioma noticed that the structure resembled something taken from a magic tower. Joaquin definitely did not seem like an ordinary person. Shortly afterward, he found footprints on the staircase. Although they had not seen anyone during the exam, it was clear that another group had passed through there. Following those tracks, he eventually discovered traces of blood on the floor. Then he heard a scream coming from several floors above and immediately rushed up the staircase. At that moment, Saki was lying on the ground with blurred vision after being struck by a poisoned blade. Meanwhile, Leon was fighting the instructor Paul, who was actually a villain who had infiltrated the academy. Saki realized at that moment that he truly belonged to the villain group. Leon unleashed a powerful strike at the instructor, narrowly missing him and destroying part of the wall near the staircase. The instructor remarked that such strength was worthy of a hero candidate. Soon afterward, he was nearly caught off guard by another attack from Leon. However, Leon was also struck by surprise by Luna Ariel's claws, revealing that she was on the villain's side. Ariel remarked that Paul still seemed unaccustomed to Lord Permush's power. He apologized, and she replied that it was fine, since he had performed his part of the mission well. She then asked whether that really was the hero. To her, he did not even seem suitable as a vessel, and she was surprised that Corey had been defeated by someone like him. Paul reminded her that even without any equipment, Leon had managed to make it that far in a place resembling the demon world. According to him, Corey probably had poor compatibility with the body she had received. Besides, rumors said the Sword Emperor was present, so the story had to be true. Ariel admitted that perhaps her expectations had been too high. Even so, she believed they would hardly find a better vessel than Leon. If Master Permush could adapt the possession to his body, everything should work. Their new master would certainly be quite pleased with the result. At that moment, Ariel realized that Saki was still conscious. Saki, however, realized that she did not want her life to end that way. Until then, her life had seemed empty, confined to a repetitive routine and a bleak family environment. There had rarely been any fun, excitement, or reason to expect anything different. She had not entered the academy because she dreamed of becoming a heroine. In truth, she had been searching for a reason to give up on everything, but now she realized she did not want that ending. Ariel asked Saki what she thought of her performance. She had feared being discovered, but the confusion Saki herself caused had ended up making her disguise much easier to maintain. Saki then asked why Ariel was doing all of this. Ariel replied that the reason was simple. She had been deeply disappointed in Saki because, despite barely knowing her, she had believed for a long time that the two of them were alike. Those lifeless eyes and the expression of someone weary of the world had made Ariel believe Saki was like them. That was why she had planned to take her to Master Permush once the mission ended. Ariel said this while keeping the dagger pressed against Saki, worsening her pain even further. She asked what had happened to Saki. After wanting to carry another person on her back, it seemed she had suddenly developed some affection for humanity. Ariel said she was truly disappointed in Saki and claimed she had no time to listen to explanations. Since they had already talked quite a bit, at least she would not be alone at that moment. Then she simply left her behind. Only then did Saki realize that she wanted to keep living. For the first time, she felt that perhaps she had found a reason to move forward. At that moment, amid the light, she saw Kanjioma appear and asked for his help. Ariel, meanwhile, wondered whether they had finally received some company. When Choi Sol understood what was happening, she realized that both the hero candidate Leon and Lunasaki had been attacked. Even so, she felt somewhat relieved when she realized that both of them were still breathing. Ariel greeted Choi Sol after such a long time and asked whether she also wanted to form a contract with Permush. After all, her former lord had died, although a traitor like her might not even deserve a new master. Choi Sol grew irritated at that, thinking that Ariel was the one who had switched sides at the first opportunity. Ariel then asked whether that man was the famous sashimi swordsman. She advised him to stay still. She admitted that breaking Iron Leg had been impressive, but given the situation, it would be better for him to understand his position. As she said this, she kept Leon pinned to the floor with her foot pressed against his head. Even the hero candidate was completely exhausted in a corner. As an ordinary human, he could hardly do anything in that situation. He then made Choi Sol an offer. Since he needed to get rid of that boy, he would speak with Master Permush. Since she had the weapons, she could handle it. When Kang Jioma gestured with his hand, she looked around and remembered everything she had endured. Then she drew his sword. Afterward, she handed the weapon to Kang Jioma with the obedience of someone standing before her master. He called her completely insane. The instant he gripped the knife, the sword god's protection began to react. The power manifested completely. Kang Jioma was determined to defeat everyone who remained in his way. Paul launched his rocks and said he would take care of Kang Jioma. Ariel merely asked him not to do anything to Choi Sol. Kang Jioma, however, neutralized every attack with precise movements of his blade. Paul admitted that even landing a hit on Jioma was difficult. Even so, he trusted his abilities and believed he would win, especially because mana was abundant in that place. There, he could use magic almost without limits and was convinced he would not lose. That was why he was glad he had followed Ariel and made a contract with Permush. He then launched countless flaming rocks that streaked through the air like small comets. One nearly struck Choi Sol, who was surprised to realize that Paul could now control two elements. Paul continued pursuing Jioma with a rain of meteors and taunted him, saying he should finally understand Permush's true power. He also declared that a mere human needed to know his place. However, while he was speaking, something unexpected happened. A strike landed directly on his waist. Confused, Paul tried to figure out where the attack had come from. Meanwhile, his own stones were destroying and scattering the rocks around him. The massive accumulation of rocks might have been providing cover for Jioma to move without being noticed. Irritated, Paul thought that his opponent was genuinely difficult to keep track of. Soon afterward, another strike hit exactly the same spot as before. Paul responded by unleashing even more fire and rocks, destroying parts of the floor, walls, and even the tower ceiling. He said he did not care if the tower collapsed. Even so, Kang Jioma struck him in the waist once again. Paul realized that Jioma could have targeted a far more dangerous spot, but had deliberately chosen not to. Paul then noticed that Kang Jioma was striking the exact same place where he had hit Leon. It became clear that the human was mocking him. Overcome with rage, Paul underwent his demonic transformation, growing considerably larger and losing part of his control. His body became covered in rock and magma as he prepared an attack powerful enough to finish Jioma. However, a single movement of the blade was enough to completely stop his offensive. The strike pierced through the villain's defense and even reached the tower wall, as though Kang Jioma's blade could cut through space itself. Choi Sol was impressed by the sight and thought that, by Jioma's side, she might truly be able to remain safe. Ariel watched everything in fear and concluded that the boy was far more dangerous than she had imagined. Nervous, she ordered Kang Jioma not to come any closer and demanded that he keep his distance. To Ariel, it was like standing before a true demon. Kang Jioma was already preparing to advance. She realized that escaping would be nearly impossible. He was far too fast, so she began thinking of another way out. Ariel created a smokescreen, but soon realized that she could barely sense the magical power around her. It was almost as if Kang Jioma's very aura was driving the surrounding magical power away. Desperate, Ariel grabbed Saki as a hostage and ordered Jioma not to move. He remained still while she tried to retreat. Saki, however, told Ariel to release her and use the opening to grab the nearby knife. She then reacted quickly and struck Ariel before she could continue threatening her. Saki revealed that she was very good at pretending and explained that poison resistance was something basic within her family. She added that she had expected more from a demonic human sportswoman like Ariel and was even somewhat disappointed. Ariel eventually succumbed to the effects of the poison and could no longer continue fighting. Saki also lost her strength, but Kang Jioma immediately dropped his knife and caught her before she could fall. It was at that exact moment that the rest of the group arrived and witnessed the entire scene. Saki complained that it hurt a little and asked Kang Jioma not to hold her so tightly. She remembered that a few days earlier, he had promised to grant one of her wishes, so she simply asked to remain in his arms a little longer. Sometime later, Saki woke up in the academy infirmary. She was still injured and quite weak, but she had finally regained consciousness. Speed Weapon asked whether she knew how long she had been asleep. After learning it had been 3 days, Saki began remembering everything that had happened. Speed Weapon remarked that he now owed the club president a favor. According to Rachel, Kang Jioma had given first aid to Saki and Leon. Speed Weapon had not even known he possessed a healing blessing, but the doctors praised the treatment. Surprised, Saki repeated Kang Jioma's name in her mind. Then she remembered being held in his arms and immediately felt overwhelmingly embarrassed. Saki began wondering how she would ever face Kang Jioma after everything that had happened. At that moment, Speed Weapon interpreted her expression as a sign that she was still shaken by what had happened. Saki noticed his stare and asked why he was looking at her that way. Speed Weapon concluded that she really must have been traumatized because she seemed even stranger than usual. Without arguing, he simply handed her a sweet she liked, hoping it would help her calm down. Saki became irritated by the way he told her to calm down and responded by hitting him with a pillow. She complained that she was not some dog and ordered that brat to get out immediately. After he left, Saki realized she had overreacted for no reason and decided she would apologize later. Even so, she felt relieved to be alive. The thought moved her deeply. After everything that had happened, she realized that she still wanted to keep living and was happy that she had managed to survive. Viva began chewing her candy and remarked with satisfaction that it was really delicious. Meanwhile, Kang Jioma reflected on everything that had happened 3 days after that exam. Leon and Saki had suffered extremely severe injuries and had even fallen into critical condition. Even so, Kang Jioma decided to risk everything, activated all his blessings, and, fortunately, managed to keep them alive. Medea was extremely worried about everything that had happened, and so was Kang Jioma. He realized that this no longer involved only himself. Other people had been caught up in it, and power alone would not be enough. He needed something greater. As he approached Saki's room, he noticed Speed Weapon being sent outside. Speed Weapon explained that it was his turn to look after her that day, but he had ended up leaving the room. He said emotionally that he was glad Kang Jioma had come to visit her, sparing him from continuing to worry. He then informed him that she had awakened. Physically, she seemed fine, but there was another problem. Everything indicated that she was suffering from severe post-traumatic stress. Sometimes she would suddenly start screaming, and she had even thrown a pillow. Kang Jioma thought that, considering everything, she had recovered remarkably well. He then asked Speed Weapon how the investigation into the villains was progressing. He replied that Rachel was helping as well, and that the investigation was practically complete. He then handed him a document containing several names, a list of the main suspects believed to have connections with the villains. The list contains 6 names: Harvo Chan, Jiraiya Shikagi, Ebi Ashiro, Nobara Hiroshi, Igari Shinji, and Amuno Hei, all academy employees working in different departments. Kang Jioma noticed there were 6 people, and none of them were professors. There had to be more people involved, so he asked whether Speed Weapon was absolutely certain about those names. He replied that he was. Since he would be free the next day and Saki had already awakened, he suggested that they all visit her together. Kang Jioma asked how he still failed to understand Saki after knowing her for so long. She would not be happy with everyone visiting at once and needed some space. Speed Weapon then asked what he should do the next day. Kang Jioma replied that it was their turn to act and launch a counterattack. Meanwhile, Medea, the Sword Emperor, and Altair were gathered in a private meeting. Medea asked whether Claude was involved with the elders. Altair confirmed it, saying that he had persuaded the others and had also been behind the demons appearing during the midterm exams. Siegfried explained that they were still investigating Claude's transactions and even suspected that he had hired the Undertaker. Medea was surprised to hear the name Undertaker and asked whether they were talking about that group of assassins. Her anger was so intense that the ground beneath her feet began to crack. Altair said they had received reports that the group had been spotted on Avalon Island. Siegfried then asked Medea to remain calm. She shot back, asking whether they expected her to sit quietly drinking tea like him. After all, it was her responsibility to keep everyone at the academy safe. Even so, an intruder had dared to cause all of this, and to make matters worse, someone connected to the council itself was involved. Despite every preventive measure they had taken, something of this magnitude had happened practically right in front of them. Altair replied that she was not the only one furious. His own granddaughter also studied at that academy, and he had other reasons for his anger as well. Siegfried then asked whether they had gathered enough evidence. Altair replied that they had investigated and verified all the information from the past 2 months. According to him, they already had enough evidence to act immediately against everyone involved. After hearing that, Siegfried decided that the operation would take place that very night. At that moment, Kang Jioma suddenly entered the room and announced that he needed to discuss an urgent matter. Medea immediately asked what exactly was happening. He explained that he had come because of what had happened during the final exams. Speed Weapon and the others then began reporting everything they had discovered. Speed Weapon concluded his explanation by saying that this was all the information they had on the infiltrated villains. The other two remained silent for a few moments. Medea then asked if that was Speed Weapon, Leon's companion. Although she knew they traveled together, it was the first time she had met him in person. In that case, the individuals on that list probably had some kind of connection to the demons. Speed Weapon confirmed it. Even after several checks, the hiring records and recent activities of those people continued to show numerous irregularities. Medea examined the document using her blessing and declared that, based on what she had just confirmed, those people did not truly belong to the academy at all. Kang Jioma concluded that if she had verified it with the poet's blessing, then the information was certainly true. However, the director raised another issue. As mere cadets, how had they managed to print that list? After all, it contained confidential employee information. She demanded an answer. Speed Weapon cast a nervous glance toward Kang Jioma. Kang Jioma replied that it had been possible because they were using the academy's internal network, practically admitting what they had done. Medea asked whether they had actually broken into one of the most heavily protected networks on the planet. Kang Jioma confirmed it and took full responsibility, saying that as club president, he had given the order. He explained that Speed Weapon, despite appearances, was the second best in the class and highly skilled with computers. He knew they had done something wrong, but believed the director would understand the urgency of the situation. Medea replied that since their intentions had been good, she would let it slide this time. Even so, she ordered them never to do it again. She was only trusting them because of Kang Jioma's record, since other cadets would probably have been expelled immediately. Speed Weapon finally breathed a sigh of relief. Kang Jioma realized how frightened he had been and also noticed that he had never mentioned Saki, proving that he was a more loyal friend than he appeared. Siegfried remarked that the situation had just become even more complicated. He explained that they intended to move against those elders that night, but then realized that the students were still in the room. Altair told the Sword Emperor that if the young people were also involved in the situation, they had the right to know what was happening. Siegfried agreed. He explained that he had originally intended to go to Claude's private mansion that night, then revealed to Kang Jioma who had tried to harm him and his companions. Those responsible were members of the Council of Elders, led by a man named Claude. Siegfried intended to catch them off guard with the evidence gathered by the auditors, although the rules still limited his actions. Kang Jioma knew that even with solid evidence, it would be difficult for the Sword Emperor to confront the Council of Elders directly. After all, he was no longer one of the 7 heroes, while the Council remained a major pillar of power. Siegfried explained that if they struck the Elders first, the infiltrated villains would disappear from the academy. Medea agreed, but she also knew they could not allow the Council to continue acting freely. Kang Jioma concluded that they needed to strike both sides at the same time. He then suggested a simple way to accomplish that: gather everyone in the same place. He called Choi Sol, who immediately became alarmed and asked what had happened. Jioma asked whether the villains truly did not know one another. Choi Sol confirmed that, for the most part, that was exactly the case. He then ordered her to gather every name he mentioned from that moment onward, because each one belonged to a villain. Choi Sol asked how she was supposed to do that. He replied that he would simply send her a prepared message for her to copy. Siegfried confirmed the plan. The Aditor, who were authorized to judge nobles, would raid Claude's mansion, while he and Medea attacked the place where the villains had gathered. Kang Jioma confirmed that this was correct. Siegfried admitted that the plan could work. Medea, however, remained concerned and asked how Jioma intended to gather all those villains together. He apologized to the headmistress, but said they needed to leave immediately. He would explain all the details afterward. Altair remarked that he preferred acting before explaining. At that rate, he seemed more like an Aditor than anything else. Siegfried asked how many men Altair had brought. He replied that, as a precaution, he had selected only the best ones available. Siegfried pointed out, however, that the council also had its own escort, consisting of 8 auditors. Kang Jioma stated that he would personally go to Claude's mansion with the Aditor. As a victim directly involved in the case, he also had reason to participate. Furthermore, he was one of the leading candidates to become one of the 7 stars and was regarded as the future successor to the Sword Emperor. Upon hearing that, everyone exchanged utterly astonished looks. Siegfried realized that he had finally made his decision. Kang Jioma showed no hesitation whatsoever. Later, Speed Weapon asked whether he truly intended to go through with it. Kang Jioma confirmed it and asked him to wait there. He said he would take care of everything and return shortly. Speed Weapon simply asked him not to push beyond his own limits. Meanwhile, every villain listed among the staff received the same anonymous message. It claimed that a chain message originating in the Maple Kingdom brought good luck, but that something bad would happen at 3 in the morning if they failed to go to the designated location. One of the villains became irritated after reading it and demanded to know who thought they had the right to send such an absurd message. Another remarked that it really did seem like something Professor would do. Even so, one of them complained that they could not simply be ordered around like that. The group became irritated over the message alone. One of them even remarked that he could not stand Professor either. Even so, they knew they had no choice. No matter how much they hated Professor, if he ordered them to jump, they would probably have to obey. Before long, someone asked why only they were present and where the others were. At that moment, someone finally appeared. They all assumed it was some employee sent by Professor to deal with the situation, but they were completely mistaken. The person who had arrived was there to deal with something very different from what they expected. The first villain who tried to hide in the shadows was quickly neutralized. Medea remarked that she felt calm, perhaps even a little too calm for the situation. She then greeted the villains in a decidedly unfriendly manner. The headmistress had already taken down the first one before the others could even react. On the way to the other meeting point, Altair remarked that Gioma was an extremely peculiar young man. Even someone as experienced as he was could not understand what kind of person that boy truly was, much less figure out what went through his mind. His gaze was empty, and his black eyes showed almost no emotion. Altair felt as though his feelings and humanity had been stripped away, leaving behind something resembling a blade. He then asked whether Gioma knew where the line lay between a human being and a creature driven only by its own impulses. Gioma asked what that had to do with his situation. Altair merely replied that he should be careful not to turn into a monster. When Altair struck his cane against the ground, the Aditor assassins silently emerged from the shadows. Among those assassins was Nox. Kang Gioma remembered that Altair had said he had brought only elite members. That meant Nox had to be genuinely skilled. Altair ordered the Aditor to carry out the punishment against those involved in corruption in the name of the family. The first villain was taken down in front of Medea before the others could even react. Despite her elegant appearance as someone barely over 20, Medea was a seasoned veteran who had endured countless battles throughout her life. One of the villains unleashed his demonic power and warned the others not to be deceived by her appearance. He claimed that Medea was a veteran who had been away from the front lines for more than 40 years and believed the power bestowed by his master would be enough to defeat her. The instant he charged forward to attack, Medea reacted immediately. With only a small step to the side, she dodged and calmly remarked that those days belonged to the past. She then defeated him swiftly with one of her weapons. Afterward, she kicked the already defeated opponent away without showing the slightest difficulty. She sent him crashing to the ground with ease. Among the 7-star heroes, Medea was the only one without a fixed position. Even so, she carried another widely known title, the Tyrant. Naturally, the remaining villains began fighting desperately to escape. When another tried to attack her from behind, someone intervened. The Sword Emperor neutralized the attack in an instant, leaving the remaining villains even more terrified. Siegfried asked why she still had not gotten rid of that old outfit. It was exactly the same clothing she had worn back then. Medea replied that she had never forgotten those days. The remaining villains unleashed all the magical power they could gather, while Medea advanced to bring the confrontation to a swift end. Meanwhile, at the Elder's mansion, one of the staff noticed that a lamp was flickering strangely. When the light finally went out, he approached to inspect the problem and was caught by surprise. Before he could react, the Aditor had already fully infiltrated the mansion and begun taking control of the area. One of them calmly walked across the residence's carpet as though the invasion were nothing more than routine work. The guards who witnessed the scene were utterly terrified. Altair ordered the assassins to clear the way. The guards were neutralized within moments, and Gioma was impressed by their efficiency. He did not even need to participate directly. Throughout the entire advance, he remained protected by the others. Gioma continued moving through the scene in silence without uttering a single word. Altair remarked that, despite everything being confidential, that place was enormous. Kang Gioma asked if he was not worried, since executing an elder, even with solid evidence, still carried great risks. Altair replied that they were members of Tony's family. If they had evidence and still did nothing, that would become the real problem. Besides, with him among the next 7 heroes, the consequences would probably be far less severe. At that moment, one of the assassins emerged from the shadows and reported that everyone had already entered Lady Clyde's office. When they reached the designated location, Altair immediately sensed that something was wrong with the place. It was far too quiet. Nox was also accompanying the group. Everyone had gathered there, and Kang Gioma was the one who took the initiative to open the doors. They entered another section of the mansion, even larger than the last, completely dark and shrouded in an unsettling silence. One of the assassins then approached his master to deliver some information. However, before he could finish, he was suddenly struck and collapsed on the spot. When the lights finally came on, they discovered that all the assassins had already been defeated. Nox was visibly shaken by what he saw. Altair, however, ordered him to keep his emotions under control. Kang Gioma noticed, however, that even the old man seemed deeply affected. Soon afterward, Claude's men appeared and mocked Altair for telling everyone to remain calm even in such a situation. He sneered that such behavior was only to be expected from the head of Tori's family, an old man who apparently had no feelings. Nox then asked if they were the ones responsible for what had happened to his companions. The large man replied that it was extremely insolent to interrupt a conversation between adults. He continued taunting them, saying he had considered keeping a memento from the assassins, but the smell was unbearable. Since they were family, they could take their companions back with them. Altair was furious. Elder Claude himself stepped forward and asked how Altair dared oppose those villains, especially that contemptible butcher who had infiltrated the nobility. Altair called Claude a bastard and asked how someone in his position could ally himself with such despicable people. Claude ordered him to shut his mouth, saying that a mere butcher had no right to lecture an elder like him. He then declared that he would personally wipe out Altair's entire family. Altair replied that Claude was nothing more than a demonic parasite and should at least feel ashamed before his own ancestors. The large man told Clyde to stop. Clyde complained that Altair had mentioned his father, but the villain interrupted him again and stepped forward. His eyes soon turned toward Kangjioma. An unprecedented golden generation had emerged at that academy. Even among so many talented students, the one who had surpassed them all and claimed first place was the other candidate for a host, Kangjioma. He was clearly different. Even Legion commanders had shown interest in the boy, and the villain's leader believed they could take him away without much difficulty. However, when Kangjioma met his gaze without flinching, the large man felt an unexpected pressure. Claude asked how a mere brat dared stare at them like that. Without Medea's protection, he claimed Kangjioma would not leave that place easily. Kangjioma remained silent while the elder continued watching him closely. The other infiltrated villains also noticed Kangjioma's presence and demeanor. To them, this seemed like the perfect moment to finally settle the score. Kangjioma drew his sword and said he would handle the magic, while his assassin companions could deal with the opponents. As soon as everyone assumed their combat positions, the villains displayed absolute confidence in their victory. Kangjioma then activated the sword god's protection, causing its power to manifest. When they mocked him by asking if he truly intended to cut through magic with that tiny sashimi blade, Gioma calmly replied that he would do exactly that. The villains unleashed all the magic they could muster at once. When smoke filled the area, they believed Kangjioma had certainly been defeated. However, one of the villains noticed a figure hiding farther back and immediately tried to advance. Before he could get far, Nox and Altair intercepted him and quickly brought him down. The large man tried to understand what had happened. The magic had completely missed its target, and he ordered his allies to stop acting without thinking. Even so, they attacked again, unleashing spells of ice, fire, and other elements. Taking advantage of the smoke spreading through the area, Nox charged forward once again. He did not even need to dodge the stone spell coming toward him because Kangjioma had already reacted. Kangjioma simply sliced the spell in half. The idea of someone cutting through magic seemed absurd, and moments later Nox managed to neutralize that mage. The large man ordered the others to attack immediately. When they asked why he was not doing the same, he replied that he was merely observing the situation. The ice and fire mages continued increasing the power of their attacks, thrilled to finally have the chance to unleash so much magic. Even so, not a single attack struck its target. The fire mage was quickly defeated, and shortly afterward, her companion fell as well. Altair remarked that this was a good opportunity, since the enemies were diverting their attention away from the true danger. The stone villain tried to catch Altair off guard with an enormous club and declared that Altair was the one who had been distracted. However, Kangjioma neutralized the attack with his sashimi blade, allowing Nox to finish the fight. Claude could barely follow what was happening. Everything was moving too quickly, and he realized they needed to restore their visibility. The large man then used his wind magic to completely disperse the smoke covering the area. When he could finally see clearly, he realized that all his allies had already been defeated. Kangjioma continued advancing slowly, step by step, showing no intention of stopping. Desperate, the large man grabbed Elder Claude and threatened to harm him if Kangjioma came any closer. Kangjioma merely gave a faint smile and continued walking in the same direction. It was then that someone new suddenly entered the building. It was the man known as the Professor, a mysterious figure wearing a mask and hood. The Professor remarked that he had not expected everyone except one person to be defeated, since that outcome had fallen outside his calculations. Even so, for an educator, few things were as rewarding as witnessing the growth of his own students. Grandeur asked why he had only appeared after everyone was already gathered. If he had arrived earlier, perhaps none of this would have happened. The Professor replied that blaming him for their own weakness was ridiculous. They were even more spoiled than the students. Grandeur shot back that many people had fallen because of him, and that arriving late only to say something like that was absurd. The Professor replied that he had always heard empty barrels made the most noise, but he had never imagined one could be this loud. The large man accused the Professor of being someone who hid behind a mask. At that moment, he finally removed the mask. Meanwhile, Medea was finishing off the last remaining villain. The man begged for mercy, saying he would do anything. If she wanted information, all she had to do was ask. Medea, however, crushed his remaining resistance and said that she obviously would never believe his words. Siegfried remarked that everything there seemed to be settled, but asked whether there had really been only 6 enemies in total. Then, without warning, the entire building began to shake. Medea realized that the vibration was coming from the nearby annex. The Professor simply snapped his fingers, making the entire structure tremble, and told his disciple that he was making far too much noise. With a single snap of his fingers, the large man was immediately neutralized. It was at that moment that the Professor's true identity was revealed. It was Damien. Not even Kangjioma had expected to find Damien in that place. Damien asked whether he was curious about how he had gotten there. He said he would explain everything, so Kangjioma should not get so irritated. He had placed a listening spell on Choi Sol. Since she was extremely attached to her own life, Damien had been certain that when danger came, she would eventually resort to the game. Kangjioma asked about what Damien had said earlier regarding the blessing. He replied that there was no need to worry. His curiosity as a scholar had been genuine, just like everything he had explained. Kang Jioma then asked why Damien was doing all of this. Damien said he would explain. The reason was simple. He needed a vessel. However, something had gone outside his calculations, and two nuisances still remained in his way. The moment Damien activated his magic, Geomex shouted a warning to Nox. Nox managed to evade the attack at the very last instant. Damien told them to stop resisting, saying that he disliked fighting unnecessary battles. Damien began creating spheres of concentrated power capable of eliminating his opponents. Altair could barely avoid the attacks. The professor remarked that Altair kept dodging, just as expected of an auditor. Kang Jioma also charged at Damien, but the enemy reacted immediately. Damien manifested his power directly in front of his face, forcing Kang Jioma to use all his speed to avoid making contact. Damien said that even if they were badly injured, they could still serve as vessels. Even so, if possible, he preferred to capture them in good condition. He then asked them to cooperate a little, and once again launched those spheres capable of distorting space. Altair realized that the magic could not be cut through easily. Even getting close to it was difficult. Kang Jioma explained that the spell compressed the air and caused it to explode at a designated point. If they tried to cut it directly, they could be caught in the resulting blast. Damien asked whether he was already familiar with that kind of magic. Just as he had expected, Kang Jioma really was different from the others. Damien continued launching his attacks, causing repeated explosions to strike everything around them. Kang Jioma noticed that Damien used a specific hand motion to activate the spell. The problem was determining exactly where each explosion would appear. His blessing was close to wearing off. Simply continuing to dodge would not be enough. The assassins tried to detect any change in the flow of air. Altair and Nox managed to escape again by the narrowest margin. Kang Jioma then realized that the explosions were not occurring at exactly the same time. Damien kept concentrating his attacks on Geomech, as though trying to discipline him by force. Jamar began to understand the pattern. The farther away the target point was, the greater the delay. Damien activated everything simultaneously, but there was a slight interval before each explosion occurred. The Elder was impressed and ordered Damien to finish them all off that way. However, Cyan himself was nearly struck by one of the attacks. Cyan asked whether Damien had not come to help him and why he was attacking his side as well. After all, had he not gathered those villains because of him? Damien merely laughed at the question. To Damien, Cyan had no value whatsoever. He was merely someone who spent his life clinging to others, and even the worst insults seemed insufficient to describe him. Damien said that even his father must be lamenting him in hell. Cyan had served only as bait to scatter the enemies, since Damien could not face the Sword Emperor, the Director, and the Auditors by himself. Damien explained that those villains had not been gathered to protect Cyan. In truth, he had kept them trapped in that place to prevent anyone from escaping. According to Damien, Cyan had always been a coward. He then called out to the Elder Claude and said that despite the defeats, his true objective had already been achieved. After that, he prepared to eliminate the Elder. At that instant, Kang Jioma activated his mental image. Inside his domain, he could perceive everything in the smallest fractions of a second. He saw a mass of air forming around the Elder. That mass was connected to the professor by something resembling a fuse, a thin thread linking them together. Kang Jioma finally identified the exact point where he needed to break the spell and threw his knife. The blade severed Damien's magic. Surprised, he asked what was happening and why his spell had failed. Damien snapped his fingers repeatedly, trying to activate the magic again, but Kang Jioma had already understood how it worked. He pulled the knife back using the bandana tied to the handle. Kang Jioma warned Damien that Claude was his target. That day, he intended to settle everything with him. To Kang Jioma, time seemed relative. While deciphering Damien's magic, it felt as though not even a second had passed. Finally, the line connecting each explosion became visible. Now, Kang Jioma knew exactly how to sever every one of those connections. Damien insisted that it had only been a coincidence and immediately created another sphere of wind. Once again, Gene Marks manifested the resonance of the Sword God's blessing, allowing Kang Jioma to perceive every detail. Now that he had understood the magic with his mind's eye, Kang Jioma could see it with absolute clarity. Once again, he cut through that wind thread at the exact moment, as though he already knew where it would appear. Damien asked in disbelief whether he could truly see it. To him, that simply should not have been possible. After all, no human should have been able to see that technique, no matter how sharp their senses were. He then created countless spheres at once, saying that now he wanted to find out whether Kang Jioma could handle all of them simultaneously. However, in an instant, Kang Jioma cut through every thread that appeared around him. Damien kept trying again and again, causing everything around him to explode. Kang Jioma simply continued cutting down every attack that appeared, giving his opponent no opening whatsoever. The figure hidden in the shadows, responsible for dragging everyone around Kang Jioma into that situation, was finally standing before him. Damien's fingers were already injured from the strain of continuously producing his wind threads. He declared that everything was finally over. However, something was still wrong. Numerous magical bombs were scattered throughout the area, all connected to one another by the threads. Kang Jioma used his blade to alter the flow of magic, gathered all the bombs into a single point, and sent them straight back at the enemy. Damien ended up being defeated by the very magic he had prepared. His body collapsed to the ground, bringing the confrontation to a definitive end. Afterward, Kang Jioma put away his sashimi knife once again. Claude tried to escape, but Nox quickly intercepted him with his blade. Later, Claude was under Altair's control and threatened to drag the entire nobility into the matter, insisting that things would not end that way. Altair replied that he talked far too much for someone who had betrayed humanity and immediately kept him under threat. Then Jean-Mar took over his part and began doing what needed to be done. Curiously, the next blow did not finish Claude off. Instead, Jean-Mar used his ability to restore him. He alternated between injuring and healing him, prolonging the punishment solely to make him suffer the consequences. When Claude finally began to believe that he would survive and that it was all over, his hope vanished when he received the final blow. Altair remarked to Nox that he seemed far more comfortable than expected. Nox replied that he had simply grown accustomed to it. As Altair probably already knew, he himself had once felt the weight of Kang Geoma's blade after provoking him out of sheer pride. Even though he was considered a genius, back then he had not even managed to injure Kang Geoma. He had felt completely powerless, but now he saw everything differently. Chloe once claimed that Kang Geoma alone was stronger than the entire Tori family. Nox thought it was an exaggeration, but now he had to admit that he had never seen anyone so powerful wield their strength in such a way. Nox understood why Chloe had grown so attached to Kang Geoma. His master had always taught him to value the family legacy, but also to follow his convictions. Because of that, he decided to become Kang Geoma's shadow. Altair asked whether he would end up regretting that choice. Nox firmly replied that he knew he would not, calling him master. Shortly afterward, Medea and Siegfried arrived at the scene to assess the outcome. Altair explained that they could see the situation for themselves. There had been a swift ambush, but Kang Geoma had resolved everything, including the problem with Sklade, although some losses had occurred. Medea was surprised to learn that Letitos Aditor had been defeated and said that it made no sense. She then asked what exactly the villains had been planning. Altair explained that a man known as Professor, the leader of the infiltrated villains, had sent his forces to carry out the plan. Siegfried immediately asked him to explain everything in greater detail. Altair then told the entire story, and Medea reacted by saying that it was completely absurd. Siegfried, however, thought of Kang Geoma. To him, the boy seemed like a sword without emotion or judgment, a blade capable of piercing through any obstacle before him. Altair acknowledged that he possessed extraordinary talent, but warned that a blade without direction could eventually become a calamity. The greater someone's talent, the more necessary it became to have a guide capable of leading them down the right path. Altair then made a suggestion. He asked whether the Sword Emperor himself would not be the ideal person. With vacation approaching, he could take Kang Geoma with him during that period. If it was that boy, perhaps he could finally accomplish what had been passed down through generations of the Nibelung family, the ancient wish of the Sword Saint. A few days later, routine had returned to normal within the academy. Everyone was already talking about their vacation plans, while Kang Geoma was still thinking about the remaining cleanup they needed to finish. Chloe approached him with a concerned expression and began talking about the vacation period. She confessed that she did not want to spend all that time away from Kang Geoma. At that moment, Saki finally returned to the academy, apparently recovered. When she arrived, she asked whether Kang Geoma was already there and ended up looking slightly embarrassed. Saki confirmed that she was feeling better, while Chloe asked her to continue taking good care of her health. Kang Geoma asked what the doctors had said and whether she had already been discharged. Saki explained that she still had a few follow-up appointments, but her condition had improved considerably. Taking advantage of the conversation, Saki asked what Kang Geoma intended to do during the vacation. He replied that he would probably stay at the academy, since he did not actually have any definite plans. The two were surprised to hear that he would spend the entire month there. Kang Geoma explained that he simply had nowhere else to go. Saki then noticed that something seemed different about him. She thought there were more white strands in his hair, and Chloe immediately agreed. Kang Geoma had already noticed it while bathing. His appearance was changing little by little each day, and his hands were becoming increasingly covered in calluses. In his previous life, those calluses had represented effort and growth. Now, however, they carried an entirely different meaning. They were marks left behind by countless battles and by the lives he had been forced to take. He did not regret what he had done because he believed his enemies deserved that fate. Even so, an uncomfortable feeling was beginning to grow inside him. The strange thing was that he no longer felt as much aversion when using the knife. Before, he blamed the blessing, but now he realized that his own body reacted naturally, as though it had already been deeply engraved into him. He began wondering who Kang Geoma truly was. Even his parents had disappeared without leaving any trace, as though they had never existed, and he had no idea about his true origins. Lost in those thoughts, Kang Geoma returned to reality when Saki called him and asked whether everything was all right. He simply replied that it was nothing. Chloe then asked whether he truly intended to spend the vacation clearing more dungeons instead of returning home. Saki pulled out a knife and joked that he would probably spend his vacation clearing dungeons while she threatened to cut him. Kang Geoma told her to stop and asked why she carried that knife everywhere. She replied that he was hardly normal either. At that moment, he remembered Altair saying that monsters always believed they were perfectly normal. Gioma asked whether he was really that strange. Saki replied that he obviously was. She added that practically the entire school considered Gioma extraordinary. Then he also recalled Altair's warning that he should never allow himself to become a monster. Gioma told the girls that he was thinking about spending a few weeks of the vacation genuinely resting. Saki tried to say something to him, showing a hint of shyness. However, before she could continue, the professor appeared accompanied by the Sword Emperor. The instructor announced that summer vacation began that day. He knew everyone was excited, but reminded them that they were still students of Jokum Academy. Therefore, they should maintain their dignity both inside and outside the academy, since the institution's reputation depended on their behavior. He then gave the floor to the Sword Emperor. The students immediately wondered whether he was about to deliver an hour-long lecture. Siegfried replied that only old men disconnected from the world tended to give endless speeches. He only wanted to see how much everyone would improve by the time the next semester began. That was all. The students cheered, saying that was truly worthy of the director. Finally, vacation had arrived. Chloe wished Gioma a good vacation before leaving. When he looked toward the entrance, he noticed that Nox was already waiting for her by the door. Gioma remarked that he was curious to see how Chloe would return after the vacation. Shortly afterward, Siegfried approached Gioma. Gioma then told Saki that she could go on ahead. Siegfried asked whether he already had any specific plans for the vacation. Gioma replied that he intended to simply continue training at the academy. The Emperor explained that he had already done everything he could accomplish alone. In that case, Gioma could accompany him to the Nibelung family residence. Meanwhile, poor Saki also remained at the academy and decided to look for Gioma the following morning. She searched all around for him, but Kang Gioma was nowhere to be found. Since she had no intention of returning home either, she began wondering whether he simply had not woken up yet. Saki still clearly remembered that day when she had ended up in his arms. Thinking about it, she made her way to the men's dormitory and nearly knocked on his room door. In the end, she decided not to disturb him. Perhaps he was tired after all, it was only the first day of vacation. Yet at that very moment, Kang Gioma was already traveling on a bus. He felt somewhat nervous about traveling to an unfamiliar place. The previous day, Siegfried had said that now that Gioma had decided to inherit his legacy, it was time to teach him properly. It would essentially be a passing of the torch. However, there was an even more important reason. Tori's family had grounds to punish the traitor, but mere suspicion would be enough for the leaders of the Council of Elders to begin moving against Gioma. The vacation, with fewer people watching, was the perfect time for them to make a move. Even if Tori's family tried to prevent leaks, it would only be a matter of time before the information spread. Since preventing the rumors would be practically impossible, the best choice was to hide somewhere beyond their reach. The Nibelung family possessed a 700-year tradition of heroes and was the birthplace of Aaron Nibelung. Their main estate, Sigurd Castle, was so vast that Gioma considered it almost a small country. Within that territory, the Sword Emperor's presence practically served as law. No one in their right mind would attempt to invade that place, so relocating there truly made sense. Kang Gioma ultimately accepted the proposal. Siegfried explained that he would leave first to throw off anyone monitoring his movements. Gioma would travel separately to the Nibelung residence the following day. During the journey, he could not use any communication device, not even his phone. He asked how he was supposed to find the way without communication. Siegfried replied that there was no need to worry, since someone would appear to pick him up at the right moment. On the bus, some people recognized Gioma as the sashimi knife boy from the festival. They whispered that he was even more handsome in person, while he silently listened to everything. Gradually, more passengers began paying attention to him. Even a little girl started approaching him. Before she could, however, Abel sat down beside Kang Gioma. Surprised, he asked what she was doing there. Abel responded by asking whether no one had told him about the guide who would be accompanying him. It was then that Kang Gioma realized Abel would be his guide during the trip. He truly had no idea. Abel simply said that she hoped she could count on him during the journey. Kang Gioma thought that, considering this was her family's territory, it actually made sense. Meanwhile, several men on the bus felt intimidated when they noticed that young man sitting right beside Abel. Abel thought that this was the first time since the camp, during one of the tests, that she had been alone with Gioma. Because of that, the situation felt a little strange. She also realized that he was always surrounded by girls like Rachel, Saki, and Chloe. In any case, Gioma seemed to have an easy time getting along with practically everyone. At that moment, the driver went over a speed bump without slowing down. He apologized to the passengers, while Abel began to feel slightly nauseous. That reminded Abel of what her father used to do whenever she felt sick during trips. He would always give her that medicine. It was a small patch specifically used to relieve motion sickness. Abel thought that 10 years had already passed since that day. It had been a tragedy for her, having lost her parents, and for her grandfather as well, who had lost his own son. At that moment, Kang Gioma held out exactly the same kind of motion sickness patch to Abel and asked whether she knew what it was. She hesitated for a moment, but replied that of course she knew perfectly well what it was. After some time, they arrived at the airport. Abel woke up and realized that she had fallen asleep against Kang Gioma's shoulder. Some guide she was. Better keep it secret that she had even drooled a little. Within seconds, Abel completely changed her appearance to resemble Rachel, adjusting her hair, glasses, and clothes. She said she was not trying to avoid misunderstandings with Gioma, but it was better not to attract reporters and paparazzi at such a busy airport. Kang Gioma replied that they were not celebrities, so probably no one would recognize them. Abel, however, remarked that there were always people keeping track of their movements. Kang Gioma was a little nervous since it was his first time at an airport. Abel also seemed uneasy, but because of the risk of being recognized. Sure enough, as soon as he approached, several reporters surrounded Kang Gioma, demanding answers. He was surprised to realize that people had actually been waiting for him there. The reporters asked why he was traveling and said that the entire hero world had its eyes on him. They wanted to know whether he could reveal his upcoming plans. Kang Gioma thought it did not matter how they had discovered his trip. Without answering, he would hardly be able to get through, but his true destination during the vacation had to remain secret. So he announced that he was heading to the United States, leaving everyone present quite surprised. Some began speculating whether he intended to challenge all Milt or whether there was some other reason behind the trip. Abel grabbed Kang Gioma by the arm, and the two ran away. Upon hearing that he was supposedly going to the United States, Saki was annoyed that he had told her nothing, although she knew the trip had to remain secret. As they neared Switzerland, Kang Gioma thought the entire journey would have been much simpler if they had used the private jet. While Abel finished getting ready, something nearby ended up catching their attention. Before them stood an enormous banner bearing Abel's image. The sight of it left her deeply embarrassed. Despite all her fame, Abel still traveled economy class. Even though she belonged to one of the world's most influential families, they clearly had no taste for extravagance. Abel simply announced that they had arrived. Kang Gioma, meanwhile, was impressed by the breathtaking scenery of the Swiss Alps. Siegfried was already waiting for them and explained that he had deliberately arranged a layover to coincide with their arrival. That meant he had only just arrived as well. From the looks of things, the two had done quite well on their first trip. Kang Gioma remarked that, in the end, he had not encountered any problems during the flight. Abel asked what time Gaines would arrive, and Siegfried replied that he would be there soon, calling her darling. Abel immediately asked him to stop calling her that. Siegfried found that strange, since he had used that nickname since the day she was born. Abel explained that she did not want him calling her that in front of others since she was already grown up. At that moment, an entire fleet of security vehicles appeared before them. A man wearing an elegant cloak stepped out of a limousine surrounded by the escort. He approached Siegfried, bowed, and welcomed the lord and the young lady. It became clear that all those men were there to serve the Nibelung family. Siegfried said that Gaines remained as elegant as ever and that there was no need for such formality. Gaines replied that even this was hardly enough before humanity's hero. Gaines asked if this was the famous knife boy, but Siegfried ended the subject and said he would explain everything later. Siegfried simply asked if he could count on him. Gaines immediately replied that he could. Gaines addressed him as emperor and informed him that his team would guide them throughout the entire journey. Kang Gioma realized that the hierarchy between them was quite clear. Even so, Gaines definitely did not seem like an ordinary butler. Curious, Gioma asked who he really was. Abel replied that Gaines was the president of Switzerland, leaving Kang Gioma utterly stunned. Once they were close enough, Abel pointed through the window to show him their destination. It was Sigurd Castle, surrounded by truly breathtaking scenery. They reached the castle at the end of the day, as the sun was setting. Siegfried thanked Gaines for the smooth journey, and he replied that he was grateful for an excuse to escape the office. Gaines apologized to Kang Gioma for not having properly introduced himself yet and began by giving his full name, Gaines Sebast. He mentioned that he had watched recordings of the Academy Festival and said it was an honor to finally meet Kang Gioma in person. Gaines added that he hoped they could maintain a good relationship from then on. Siegfried asked Gaines not to put so much pressure on the boy, reminding him that Kang Gioma was still young. Gaines replied that great talent naturally attracted people. He then apologized and admitted that he had gotten carried away by the enormous potential he saw in Kang Gioma. After that, Gaines bid farewell to the Nibelung family and departed with his extensive convoy of cars. Siegfried asked what Kang Gioma thought of Gaines. He replied that the president seemed surprisingly easygoing. Siegfried explained that the entire world was interested in discovering who his future successor would be. Because of that, Gaines would certainly make his own calculations. Since he valued reason above emotion, he would remain silent as long as he believed that relationship could benefit him. Siegfried explained that there were many men like that. The higher someone rose, the more cautious they had to become, analyzing other people's intentions and, when necessary, knowing how to use them to their advantage. That was the burden of holding the position of a 7-star hero. Gioma should not reject favors like that, but neither could he ever grow complacent because of them. Siegfried warned that without setting boundaries, he would eventually lose respect and authority. Gioma would learn with time, and that was also one of the reasons he had brought him there. He then ended the conversation, saying Gioma must be hungry. Kang Gioma decided to stay a little longer and enjoy the view before going inside. He remained silent, simply watching the sun slowly disappear beyond the horizon. After the introductions and a good meal, the night passed, and before long the next morning arrived. At exactly 5 o'clock, Kang Jioma woke as the curtains in his room were opened. Shyly, responsible for cleaning, laundry, hunting, patrols, and even fighting crime, wished him good morning and informed him that the Sword Emperor was already waiting. By 6 in the morning, everyone was already gathered around the table having breakfast. Abel noticed that Kang Jioma did not seem very comfortable using a knife and fork, and he admitted that she was right. The butler Karen reminded the young lady that talking during meals was not recommended. Besides serving as butler, he handled the food, kitchen, garden, repairs, and guests. Abel became genuinely concerned when she realized Kang Jioma's situation. Later, he was chopping firewood as part of his training and realized that 4 days had already passed since his arrival. By then, he had grown accustomed to the castle's routine, that strangely strong maid, and the extremely disciplined butler. The only drawback was the lack of cell phone reception. To make matters worse, only 2 employees took care of that entire enormous estate. Kang Jioma now understood why Abel lived so frugally. The Sword Emperor was incredibly stingy, and it was precisely because of that frugality that Kang Jioma was there chopping firewood with his own hands. At least with such fresh air and a beautiful view before him, he did not have much to complain about. At 4 o'clock, Kang Jioma was meditating beside the Sword Emperor, seated in the lotus position. Siegfried explained that the foundation of his blessing was already complete. Since that power was far too strong and primitive, trying to strengthen it any further would bring no benefit. The first step would be to converse with himself. Kang Jioma understood the idea, but meditating in that position to refine the blessing was much harder than it looked. Siegfried told him to stop complaining. He was still young and would only understand true difficulty once his joints began to stiffen. 2 knocks sounded at the door, and Kang Jioma immediately recognized Karen. Karen approached the Sword Emperor to deliver some information, then whispered something directly into his ear. Siegfried reacted irritably, asking about that insane man. The butler simply confirmed that Mr. Jameis was beside him. Siegfried apologized for his exaggerated reaction, explaining that Richard was the reason. Jean Marcio then asked whether he was talking about Gaines. Siegfried decided to leave for the time being and said he would return for dinner, or perhaps a little later. He told them they could start without him. Later, Kang Jioma thought that he had expected very different training from the man regarded as humanity's strongest. He wanted to move his body and clear a dungeon, since he was already growing bored with so much peace and quiet. As he was in Switzerland, he remembered a particular dungeon nearby. While checking his knife, he remembered that he would still need at least 3 people to enter that dungeon. On the other hand, the reward was quite rare. At that moment, he heard 3 knocks at the door. Thinking it was Shyly calling him for dinner, he replied that he was already coming. However, when he opened the door, he found Abel instead of Shyly. She timidly asked whether she could come in. Before that, Abel had been thinking that 4 days had already passed since Kang Jioma arrived at Seago Castle. Even though she saw Kang Jioma almost every day, she still felt there was something different about being around him there. At breakfast, for example, he had considerable trouble with the fork and knife. Being Korean, he was clearly more accustomed to a different style of dining. At that moment, however, the butler interrupted her before she could continue speaking. Ever since she was young, her grandfather had told her to choose her men very carefully and never entrust her life to someone weaker than him. Abel always replied that this was impossible, since no one stronger than her grandfather existed. Thinking about it, she realized that advice had been repeated throughout her childhood. However, since she began spending more time around Kang Jioma, Abel had noticed something new. In another conversation, her grandfather emphasized that even if someone was extremely strong, she should still choose carefully whom to trust. Strength alone was not enough. Personality mattered as well, because someone who offers a hand without thinking could prove more dangerous than someone pointing a sword. He especially warned her about people who did good without expecting anything in return, because those were precisely the hardest people to judge cautiously. Abel asked why he was suddenly saying that. Her grandfather replied that it was merely a precaution. Afterward, he informed Karen and Shyly that Kang Jioma was a guest staying there for training and should remain in the house without being disturbed. Back in the present, Abel knew that she should not interfere with his training either. Even so, simply knowing that Kang Jioma was in the castle was enough to make her happy, almost like a child. If only he were a little kinder to her. Even so, someone doing good deeds without any ulterior motive seemed far too strange. Abel also knew she needed to return what he had lent her, but merely thinking about it already made her embarrassed. Shyly then told her that Abel's grandfather had gone out to deal with an urgent matter and would only return home later. Abel became confused and asked why she was telling her that at that particular moment. Shyly simply replied that Abel seemed interested in knowing. After that, Abel hurried toward Kang Jioma's room. On the way, however, she began to feel slightly afraid and hesitant. Before she arrived, Karen stopped her. Abel remarked that it had been a while, and that she almost seemed to have forgotten how to behave in that house after becoming so accustomed to the academy. Karen asked whether she was trying to run away again, reminding her that she always did that during important moments and looked for an escape. Orion wanted Abel to grow into someone capable of facing situations without running away. After all, Orion was her father. Even so, Abel gathered her courage, went to Kang Jioma's room, and asked whether she could enter. He allowed her in without any problem. Simply managing to enter the room already made Abel visibly happy. Kang Jioma remarked that she did not need to return the cloak, but Abel still insisted that she should. After gathering her courage, Abel asked whether he would be free the following afternoon. Kang Jioma asked why. Abel replied that she wanted to go out, then immediately complained that he had answered her question with another and insisted on knowing whether he had time. He said that the Sword Emperor would not be there the following day, so there would be no training. He also thought it would be good to take a break from the meditation that was destroying his legs. Kang Jioma then asked whether she wanted to have lunch outside the following day. Since he was in Switzerland, he wanted to try some different local food. Abel was surprised and asked whether that meant it would be a date. After hesitating, she quickly agreed and said that sounded even better than simply going for a walk. She then mentioned that she knew an excellent Japanese restaurant. Kang Jioma rejected the idea, saying that he did not want to eat sushi while he was in Switzerland. He would rather try something typical of the region. Abel asked whether he disliked sushi. He replied that he liked it, but had recently eaten it with the group. Abel then asked whether, by group, he was referring to Saki. Kang Jioma began thinking that Abel and Saki might not get along very well. He then explained that he had also eaten with Speed Weapon and Chloe besides Saki, and that Chloe loved fish just as much as he did. Abel ended up throwing the cloak at him and complained that he was terribly unfaithful before trying to correct what she had just said. In the end, she simply told him not to be late the next day. Kang Jioma could not understand her reaction. For him, figuring out what Abel was truly thinking was never easy. Outside, Abel was completely nervous and surprised to realize that it had somehow turned into a date. Meanwhile, Siegfried arrived at the scheduled meeting. One of the staff members quickly began explaining the situation, setting formalities aside. According to the report, the man had appeared suddenly and was pressuring the president to reveal whom the Sword Emperor had brought with him. Until then, however, the president had kept everything secret. Siegfried said he had already understood enough and thanked him for the report. The staff member, in turn, thanked him for coming. When Siegfried entered the room, he found an extremely tense atmosphere. Everyone kept their heads lowered, showing respect to the man seated in the chair. He remarked that it had been a long time, Nibelung, nearly 10 years. That man was Richard Murat, the Spear Saint and a 7-star hero. Siegfried asked what kind of trouble Richard was causing there this time and since when the two of them had become friends. Richard asked whether losing an arm had finally turned Siegfried into a man. Before, he had been so conceited that he resembled a spoiled little girl. Siegfried immediately placed his hand on his sword and remarked that age apparently had not treated Richard very well. He positioned the blade near Richard's legs and said he could use the opportunity to give him a similar experience. After staring each other down for several moments while their auras collided, Siegfried remarked that he had always known Murat was an idiot, but he had never imagined that Richard would be bold enough to invade the country where Siegfried lived. At that moment, the president entered the room to find out what was happening. Richard asked whether Siegfried truly dared to threaten someone from the Murat family. He said that spending time around young people seemed to have made him young again. Siegfried replied that Richard remained pathetic and he still could not understand how someone so stupid had become one of the 7 heroes. Richard stood up, and an enormous pressure immediately began emanating from his body. The two completely dominated the room with their presences. It was a legendary confrontation between figures beyond ordinary limits, the Sword Emperor, absolute master of technique, against a man who relied primarily on brute force. Richard's raw strength was so absurd that he seemed to have no need for technique at all. Very few beings could directly rival his physical power. The president asked both of them to control themselves, reminding them that they were inside the presidential residence. Richard admitted that he had gotten a little carried away and sat back down. He then said he was not there to play around and would get straight to the point. He said he would leave as soon as he heard the truth. Everyone already knew that Corey, one of the 5 generals, was dead, so they could set that part aside. The president was clearly surprised upon hearing that information. Richard asked whether the president truly did not know. The matter was already circulating through the association, although news took longer to reach Switzerland. He had also discovered Siegfried's involvement, but did not believe he could defeat a general alone. Siegfried asked whether Richard was implying something. Richard was clearly referring to Kang Jioma, the young man known as the Sword Saint of San. At that instant, Siegfried once again moved his hand toward his sword. The pressure he released was so intense that the entire building began to tremble. Richard wondered whether this was truly the power of a man who had lost an arm. Some of the people nearby could not withstand the pressure and lost consciousness. The president realized that if this continued, a real war could break out right there. Richard remarked in surprise that Siegfried seemed to have become even stronger. The emperor replied that Richard was causing trouble in his homeland and threatened to silence him. Deep down, he realized that Kang Jioma had become a target of the association and considered eliminating the Spear Saint. The president immediately tried to stop Siegfried from going any further. Richard said that Siegfried seemed to have lost his mind with age. He found it interesting to see him more explosive, but that behavior simply did not suit him. Richard finally eased the tension, placed a cigar in his mouth, and remarked that Siegfried's sensitivity revealed quite a lot. He concluded that Siegfried truly must care about that boy. He said he would not keep pressing the matter since Siegfried's reaction had already been enough of an answer. Even so, Richard said that Kang Jioma seemed quite interesting. Siegfried protected him too much, and his niece Rachel was also involved. If Rachel had fallen in love with him, there had to be some reason. Richard joked that he would love to see Nibelung's reaction if Kang Jioma ended up marrying his niece. Finally, he announced that he was leaving. Before departing, he asked them to tell Medea and her twin sister that he was doing well. Richard slammed the door as he left. Gaines asked whether the Sword Emperor was all right. Siegfried apologized for his behavior, and the president took the opportunity to ask whether he would have time the following week for the dinner mentioned earlier. Siegfried immediately realized that Gaines was trying to get closer to Kang Jioma in a rather obvious way. Because of that, he replied that he would not have time that day and added that his schedule would be full for the entire week. Meanwhile, Kang Jioma and Abel were getting ready for the outing. She was quite excited, while he looked tired from his routine of waking up early. Abel carefully chose beautiful and colorful clothes, while Kang Jioma simply grabbed whatever was available. She carefully styled her hair, while he merely noticed that more and more white strands were appearing. Abel examined several pairs of shoes before deciding which ones to wear. Kang Jioma simply put on the only pair of sneakers he owned. In the end, both were satisfied. Kang Jioma thought that he had only agreed to the outing to relax a little, though he was beginning to suspect that perhaps he had taken the situation too far. Since they would still be spending several weeks together, he thought it best to prevent any awkward atmosphere from developing between them. Fortunately, the Undead Dungeon was located in the Swiss Alps. It was a rank D dungeon, below the Buffalo Dungeon, although it concealed a secret boss. That boss was the Lich King Draugr. Kang Jioma remembered that his master, who had recommended the game to him, had quickly lost interest. Because of that, he continued playing alone for a while before eventually quitting as well. As a result, he never got the chance to face Draugr in the game. That meant he did not know the boss's attack patterns. Now, he regretted not continuing to play for longer. In any case, he intended to invite Abel to accompany him and thereby meet the minimum requirement of 3 members. After all, she was extremely skilled. Furthermore, Kang Jioma knew that he could not face an entire order in only 50 seconds, the limit of his pain tolerance blessing. With few alternatives, he decided to speak with Abel that day. It was then that he noticed how well dressed Abel was and was momentarily startled. She looked at him and asked why he was dressed like that. Kang Jioma replied that, honestly, those were practically the only clothes he had to wear. Abel merely sighed and said they should just go by car. He asked whether she had a driver's license. Abel replied that she obviously did not and asked who he thought she was. Naturally, she had called someone to drive them. The driver was Shiley. As far as Abel was concerned, she truly could handle practically any task. Abel apologized for making her take on yet another responsibility, but Shiley replied that it was no problem and that she was happy to help. Since Kang Jioma was present, Shiley said she would drive a little slower than usual. Abel, however, said she trusted her abilities completely. Kang Jioma concluded that Shiley was probably an excellent driver. She said the trip would take about 30 minutes and told him he could take the opportunity to nap. Kang Jioma immediately found that strange. 30 minutes, he clearly remembered that the journey had taken close to 3 hours. Soon afterward, Shiley began accelerating, quickly passing 100 kilometers per hour. They sped down a slope in the car, and Kang Jioma nearly got sick 3 more times. On the mountain road, they reached speeds of around 200 kilometers per hour. Jioma could only think that this woman had to be completely insane. He then asked Abel whether she did not get carsick, since she had felt sick during the bus trip. She replied that she only got motion sickness when the vehicle moved slowly. At high speeds, she felt absolutely nothing. That day was proof enough. Jioma concluded that he should never have asked. The explanation simply made no sense at all. Shiley announced that they were almost there, while Abel remarked that it had been a long time since her last visit to Geneva. When Siegfried returned home and discovered that the two had gone out, he was furious. As he drank tea, he complained that he had aged 10 years because of that brute. Perhaps this sort of thing truly came with age. At that moment, he remembered what Richard had said about Kang Jioma eventually becoming his niece's husband. Siegfried made it clear that he had no intention of standing by and allowing that possibility to happen. The butler replied that he truly had been putting in a great deal of effort. Siegfried asked whether Kang Jioma had continued training during his absence. Karen confirmed that he had practiced alone even without any supervision. Siegfried thought that Jioma was an exceedingly rare genius who, despite his talent, never tried to avoid hard work. Without a doubt, he was exceptional. At that pace, passing the required evaluation in only 1 month might not even be impossible. He then asked where the young ones were. Karen replied that the two had left early that morning to visit central Geneva. Upon hearing that, Siegfried squeezed his cup so hard that he broke the handle and asked in disbelief what Karen had just said. The two had gone out completely alone. Meanwhile, Abel remarked with satisfaction that they had finally reached their destination. Shiley said she would return to pick them up at around 5 in the afternoon without being late. Before leaving, she wished them an enjoyable outing. Kang Jioma still looked somewhat shaken and was trying to recover from the intense ride. Abel pulled Jioma by the arm, reminding him that their reservation time was approaching. She told him to hurry and stay close to her. As Abel walked through the streets, practically everyone around them found their attention drawn to her beauty. Kang Jioma, meanwhile, looked like nothing more than an ordinary guy walking a few steps behind her. Uncomfortable with all the stairs, he asked whether they could walk with a little more distance between them. Abel explained that Europe was different from Korea. The old streets could confuse any visitor, so she only wanted to guide him. Besides, she claimed that the stairs were probably because of his striking hair color. Kang Jioma thought sarcastically that, of course, he had to be the one attracting attention. Even so, no matter how unusual his hair was, it could not compare to the effect of a blessing. Abel possessed the Snowflower Blessing, which was associated with unattainable beauty. In the game, it inflicted hesitation on enemies at the start of battles and reduced their action bar by 2 points. Kang Jioma had almost forgotten that Abel had been one of the main reasons he had spent so much money on that game. In real life, however, he could already behave naturally around her. It had not been that way at first either. Before, he had been deeply impressed whenever he saw her. Perhaps after so much time, he had simply developed some resistance to the effect. When they reached the restaurant, Abel naturally took the initiative. She called the waiter over and placed their order without any difficulty. Jioma asked whether she often visited that restaurant. Abel replied that she had been coming there since childhood, often accompanied by her parents. Looking at the menu, he found raclette and asked what it was, since he had never seen that dish before. Abel explained that it was melted cheese served with meat, sausages, and vegetables. She had chosen the place because Jioma wanted to try local food. Just hearing the description made him eager to taste it. Speaking of that, go ahead and leave a like. I think it has already been a few hours since the last time I asked. Or maybe just a few minutes, who knows. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications because it helps a lot. Also join the Discord server. We announce when new videos are released there, along with the names of the series and the chapters covered, making it much harder to miss any content. If you can, take a look at the channel membership club as well. Now, let us continue the story. I think I already asked, but there is no harm in reminding you. You already left a like, good, then let us get back to the video. Abel asked whether Jioma had been thinking about Kent a moment earlier. Surprised, he jokingly asked whether she had become a fortune teller. Soon, the waiter brought the first appetizer, bread served with small pieces of meat. A knife came with the dish. Kang Jioma looked at it and could only think that once again, a knife was involved. Meanwhile, Abel was taking a few pictures of the food. Jioma noticed that in moments like that, she seemed like nothing more than an ordinary girl her own age. Abel apologized for taking out her phone during the meal and explained that it had been a long time since her last visit to that restaurant. Jioma replied that it was fine and remarked that she seemed to genuinely enjoy taking pictures of things. Abel said that she had only recently started using Stargram. For a moment, she wondered whether she should tell him her Instagram username. Kang Jioma replied that he did not care much about that sort of thing and then began asking something else. She asked if she could cut that piece of meat for him. Abel thought that entrusting food to someone brought back memories of her past, right there in that very restaurant. She told her father that she already knew how to use a knife. She could cut her own food and eat by herself. But her father replied that it was still too early. In the Nibelung family, no one held a blade before the age of 7. She protested, saying that was a lie. Grandpa had told her that her father held a sword when he was only 1 year old. Orion replied that he should not have revealed that. Abel imitated her grandfather, recalling that he had clearly said she would be a talent destined to leave her mark on history. Orion said that Grandpa was probably remembering it wrong. Then he changed the subject and asked if she could hand him the plate. He began cutting her food for her, while Abel complained that she was always treated like a child. Her mother explained that allowing someone else to take care of your food showed how much you liked and trusted them. And her father did that because he wanted to win her affection. After all, eating was one of the most important things in life. That was why she should entrust that task only to someone she truly believed in. When she became a lady, she would understand better. Until then, she could let Daddy have this one. Abel was deeply moved, and tears welled up in her eyes. Joao Marcio was confused and wondered what he had done wrong. He had only asked because of the manifestation of the blessing. Abel took the plate and apologized. The situation had stirred up a memory from the past. Now, she could cut it herself. Once she started, she cut everything with remarkable precision. The result even looked beautiful. During the first few moments of the meal, the two remained somewhat silent. Then Abel asked if he did not even want to know why she had thought that. Kang Jioma figured there must be a reason, but he did not like meddling in other people's lives. She asked if he acted that way only with her, since he got along so well with everyone else. She knew he had been the top student and began to wonder if perhaps he simply had no interest in her. Saki remained at the academy, but she no longer felt any enthusiasm. How boring. She searched everywhere for Jiomai but could not find him. Every day, she woke up without any excitement. The classrooms remained empty, and everything around her seemed equally lifeless. With frustration building in her heart, she devoted herself intensely to training. Until she began preparing her, she packed her suitcase, set aside some tropical clothes, and caught a plane to look for Kang Jioma. My God, this girl was truly determined. Abel had always been known for one thing, being the successor to the Sword Emperor's family. Everyone said she would surely surpass her own father. As the young lady of the family, she could not fail and had to live up to expectations. The pressure never stopped. Everyone kept saying that, from that moment onward, she represented the Sword of Nibel. However, that day, when Kang Jioma helped her during the test, she experienced something different for the first time. To everyone else, she was merely a Nibelung. Kang Jioma, however, saw who she truly was. He saw Abel. Now, in the present, she directly asked if he had no interest in her. Joao was completely taken aback by that question. She believed he had reasons for hiding that he held first place in the rankings, but the more she observed him, the more she realized how badly she had misunderstood everything back then. Maybe he simply did not want to deal with her, so she asked if he truly thought everyone in the world was a genius like him. There were also ordinary people like her, who sometimes needed to rely on help from others. He interrupted her, saying those words came only from insecurity. By insisting that he was different, she was diminishing all the effort he had made without even knowing what he had been through. She did not know how he had lived, and at that moment she was also devaluing all the effort she herself had made. Reducing everything to the word talent was unfair. Kang Jioma had dealt with that his entire life as well, surrounded by people who simply called him a genius. No one looked at the path he had traveled, only the result. Even with his injured hands, he continued gripping his knife. He kept sharpening the blade as he watched the Tower of Bones grow before him, and now was no different. Now he possessed something that allowed him to face opponents he could never overcome alone. The blessing. Others called it talent. Yet that power granted him strength while exacting a price from his body and mind. Nothing came for free. The original story had already changed, and he had no idea what would happen the next day. There was only one thing left to do: survive. She apologized, and he replied that it was fine. Then he suggested they continue their meal. He realized that his choice to prevent the blessing from activating had ended up causing that entire situation. It also did not seem like a good time to ask what she wanted. He even hesitated to offer a few words of comfort. Perhaps that was a consequence of his own mind, which forced him to act rationally all the time. Abel explained that her parents had disappeared in a dungeon on that exact day 10 years ago. She had eagerly awaited that vacation because she would finally have the opportunity to investigate. To enter a dungeon, one had to be an academy student. That was why the vacation meant so much to her. The difficulty of that place was not even very high, so she could not understand how her parents had disappeared. Kang Jioma immediately thought that his own parents had disappeared as well. Then he said they could go together. He already needed to clear a dungeon during that vacation, so accompanying her would be convenient. However, she replied that it had nothing to do with him. She did not want her personal problems to end up involving other people. Jioma reminded her that, above all, she was allowing him to stay in her own home. She could consider his help a way of returning the favor. Abel was moved and thanked him. Even so, it was not as though he was truly that worried about her. In truth, he had made that decision rationally. Helping Abel could bring far greater benefits. The more his synchronization rate increased, the more his humanity diminished. His heart continued growing colder and more mechanical, regardless of the situation. He did not even know what he would eventually become when everything was over. Then he asked where that dungeon was located. She replied that it was Damien of the Undead. By coincidence, it was exactly the dungeon he wanted. At the end of that day, Shiley was picked up. Abel was already asleep in the car, and Shiley took the opportunity to thank him. It had been a long time since the young lady had slept so peacefully. Today, she seemed genuinely happy. Kang Jioma thought it might be the same expression from back then and admitted that Shire was right. Meanwhile, Saki was in Los Angeles. She remarked that it was already the agreed time, but the two of them were still late. Then, she approached a group of men and asked whether they knew that man, showing them a photo. As expected, none of them knew him. Saki realized that the Sashimi Sword Saint was not as famous as she had imagined, so finding him could be quite difficult. The men said they had never seen her around there and might recognize the guy if they took a closer look at the photo. Saki refused, but one of them grabbed her, insisting that she listen to someone who was trying to help her. Before things could get worse, Rachel appeared and stopped the man, asking whether he was really looking for trouble. Speed Weapon was already calling the police, making the group flee. Saiki complained about their lateness. Rachel said it was great to see her again, and Speed Weapon asked if she was all right after such bad luck the moment she arrived. Later, the three of them were at a diner. Rachel seemed excited, while Speed Weapon said he had read the news and asked what urgent matter had brought Saki to the United States. She confirmed that it was truly urgent. Since she had traveled all the way there, she needed to ask for his help. Saki reminded them that they had both promised to help her, so they could not back out now. The two asked where they were headed. She explained that she still did not know the exact location, but she already had a few clues, including the Lancelot Company. Sometime later, Speed Weapon introduced his car called Speedwagon. With that, they began their journey toward New York. However, after some time, they ended up stranded in an extremely hot place with the vehicle completely still. The car had simply died, and she asked if that really was the famous Speedwagon. On the way back, Shiley asked Jean Mar if he had ever heard of the Undead Dungeon. He confirmed that he had and already knew the place. At that moment, Abel showed him all the information. The dungeon was located on the border between Switzerland and France, and, because it was not very popular, it received almost no attention. Even so, international hero law requires at least 3 registered people before entry is permitted. Kang Jioma realized that she had truly prepared herself. Abel knew that dungeon far better than he did, so perhaps everything would go more smoothly than he had imagined. Abel was so excited at that moment that she ended up moving a little closer than she should have. He merely remarked that she had prepared thoroughly. However, he remembered that 3 people were required and they were still missing someone. Abel explained that a senior heroine, a graduate of Joachim Academy who had been hired by the association, could accompany them. That person would be Shiley herself. Kang Jioma already knew that she was no ordinary person, but that was impressive. She ranked among the top 8% of senior heroes with 8,420 hero points. He confirmed that he had heard she would accompany them into the dungeon. Shiley said her abilities might not be enough, but she would do her best not to get in their way. Kang Jioma could not understand how a senior could possibly hinder them. Shiley explained that he might not know this, but she had graduated from Joachim Academy. Everything she had achieved, including Jane still being alive, was thanks to the Nibelung family. 10 years ago, she had been taken in by the young lady's parents, who unfortunately were no longer alive. Before that, Shiley had lived in an orphanage. She considered herself one of the lucky few to have been hired by the Nibelung family. Even now, she remained deeply grateful to the family for seeing potential in a simple maid and giving her the opportunity to study at Joachim Academy. Kang Jioma remarked that her talent must have been remarkable. She replied that compared to him, she was merely an ordinary person. Accompanying the two of them into the dungeon had also been her own decision. After all, that mission involved finding the young lady's parents, the very people who had given her a reason to live. She had also come from an ordinary class, so she was very happy when she read the articles about his accomplishments. That was how she came to like him. Even so, he could have chosen better clothes for the date. She was probably quite irritated. The next morning, Kang Jioma was summoned for a private conversation with the Emperor of Pa. As soon as he entered the room, he wondered what matter could possibly be so serious. Siegfried simply said that he needed to discuss something. However, before getting to the matter, before discussing it, he asked what Kang Jioma had done with Abel the previous day. He replied that they had merely eaten lunch together without. He pressed further, asking if he was certain. Jamal respectfully confirmed that he was. Siegfried said he was relieved. After all, it was perfectly normal for friends to have lunch together. However, he would prefer to be informed if anything similar happened again. With that settled, Siegfried almost forgot the most important matter, the true reason for their conversation. Getting straight to the point, he explained that he was still not certain, but this could eventually become a problem. It was Kang Jioma's file, containing his personal information, date of birth, and parentage. However, there was something unusual. His hero points were still being calculated. Siegfried asked him to look closely at his HP. Normally, a student's hero points should not even be calculated. This was part of an agreement between the association and the academy. Even so, his points were being calculated. Kang Jioma asked whether it was illegal, but Siegfried explained that it was not, merely something that had never happened before. A student's duty was to study, and the academy already provided sufficient evaluations. This indicated that the association did not see Kang Jioma merely as a student. The association's leader and his deputy, Richard Murat, would probably begin watching him closely. Joao Mar wondered why such important people were keeping an eye on him. Perhaps it was all connected to the recent news. Siegfried asked him not to take it too seriously. Even so, it was strange that the association was calculating his hero points at that moment. He believed it was connected to what had happened at the festival. Kang Jioma asked if he meant that strange girl, the one called Mal. Siegfried replied that he could have gone a little easier on her. Even so, he told him not to worry. If any problem arose, he would help resolve it. After all, he could do that as his guardian. Kang Jioma then realized that he now had a guardian, just as he had with his first master. At that moment, Abel interrupted the conversation and apologized for entering like that. She needed to speak with Kang Jioma about something before their departure. Siegfried, meanwhile, was entrusting his granddaughter to Joao's care. After the two of them left, Siegfried found himself thinking about his son, his daughter-in-law, and how much this matter meant to Abel. Meanwhile, the journey continued aboard the Speedwagon. Then, Speed Weapon asked what exactly she needed to deliver to the president. Saki, however, preferred not to tell him. Sometime later, they stopped at a gas station to refuel. Rachel asked how much longer they had to go. He estimated about 3 days, as long as they kept taking turns behind the wheel. Rachel then offered to drive for a while. She continued driving through that barren region until nightfall. Rachel then asked what she would do if Kang Jioma was also in New York. He did not seem like someone who would act without being certain. Rachel asked if she really liked him that much, and Saki confirmed it. Rachel was surprised by such honesty, but Saki still had no idea what she would find, and so they continued their journey. At first, everything seemed quite lively. As time passed, the journey began to grow exhausting, but when their destination finally drew near, they finally arrived, and Saki could not hide her excitement. Having never visited New York before, she was captivated by the city. When Karen appeared to serve more tea, the Sword Emperor asked if he was. He replied that he was obviously not at ease. The butler asked why he had not stopped her. After all, it was a dungeon filled with undead and countless dangers. That experience could leave her deeply shaken. Perhaps it would have been better if he had gone himself. He replied that he understood the concern for Abel, but he needed to respect her decision. After all, she was no longer a child. Abel could not remain trapped in the past forever. He could protect her, but that would prevent her from growing. Besides, Kang Jioma was by her side, and few would be capable of facing him. Karen then asked if he truly believed that. Siegfried replied that Kang Jioma could be called a genius who appeared only once in a century, but even that title failed to do the boy justice. Karen realized just how highly the Sword Emperor regarded Kang Jioma, even knowing that he had left alone with the young lady. The Sword Emperor could see the true nature of people. If he had recognized that boy's talent, he certainly had his reasons. Without a doubt, he was extraordinary. Karen replied that he understood what his master meant and asked him to call if he needed anything. Siegfried said Theron knew him better than anyone, and therefore knew that he would understand his intentions. While waiting, Kang Jioma examined the system. The 25% assimilation limit had disappeared, and his rate had reached 29.1%. Upon reaching 35%, another restriction would be removed, and memory fragments could emerge. Kang Jioma realized that the system was now giving him missions on its own. Everything seemed connected to that still unknown existence. Perhaps it was some unknown entity or life form, while the 7 fragments might reveal clues about the Sword God's blessing. If they completed the undead dungeon raid, his assimilation would also increase. The real problem would be the elite Draugr King. At that moment, he simply watched Abel training and reflected that, even if they defeated the dead, the undead would keep returning, increasing in number over time. It was a terrible matchup for his sashimi knife fighting style. He would have only 50 seconds, which Abel and Shaylee would need to secure for him. Depending on what happened, this could be just as dangerous as the situation with Corey. Even if he resorted to that power again, he had no idea what the consequences would be. Ever since that day, he had felt as though a part of his humanity was slowly disappearing. Abel wanted to find clues about her parents, a desire she had carried for 10 years. Kang Jioma would not allow something so important to be jeopardized because of him. Abel asked how she was doing, and whether it looked like she was putting too much strength into her shoulders. Then she asked what was wrong, reminding him that he had promised to watch her posture. Kang Jioma replied that he did not really know how to explain it. Even so, she resumed wielding her sword, saying that she could not become a burden to the others, especially not to those by her side, and even less so to Kang Jioma. He acknowledged that he knew little about swordsmanship, but he understood very well what it meant to repeat the same movements, performing each movement countless times, repeating everything relentlessly until it was perfected. Abel certainly had not reached that level through talent alone. The next morning, everyone was ready to leave and said goodbye to the butler and the Sword Emperor. Kang Jioma found the old man far calmer than he had expected. Perhaps it was because this was a ranked dungeon. Shaylee, however, whispered in his ear that the Sword Emperor was probably even more worried than they were. Siegfried told Kang Jioma that he would trust him and leave everything in his hands, boy. After the group departed, Siegfried also had some important matters to handle. Theron asked if this was not too sudden. After all, visiting the association without any warning seemed rather unexpected. Siegfried recalled that the Spear Saint had also appeared without ceremony. Since he had received an invitation, he would naturally accept it. Karen, however, warned that visiting the association at that hour might cause some inconvenience. As Kang Jioma's guardian, Siegfried needed to warn the association, which had begun investigating the boy. If anything threatened to obstruct the student's path, he had to intervene. It was the adult's responsibility to clear those paths. After all, there were still limits to what the young could resolve on their own. Siegfried assured Karen that he did not need to worry, because with the two of them together, there would hardly be any problems. Karen reminded him that it had been more than 20 years since he had last left the front lines. Siegfried asked if he had not been the very one who attained the rank of warrior at the age of 25. After all this time, he would once again rely on his strength, Demon Chiro. The group continued traveling toward the city where the dungeon was located. By the end of the day, they reached the city and settled into a hotel. Only one night remained before they headed for the dungeon. Kang Jioma felt a strange sense of tranquility, like the calm that comes before a storm. Meanwhile, in New York, the trio had finally arrived in front of the Lancelot Company. The three had disguised themselves as business people. Rachel questioned whether that was really necessary, but Saki replied that they could never be too careful. Revealing their true identities could cause trouble. Then, that concern returned to Saki's mind. What if Kang Jioma was not in New York? She concluded that nothing could be considered certain until they confirmed everything with their own eyes. They entered the building, but were turned away almost immediately. Afterward, they sat on a bench outside. Speed Weapon asked what they would do now. Their business people disguise was clearly useless by this point. Rachel asked why Saki did not just hack the reservations so they could get in right away. She replied that she had not learned her skills for that kind of thing. Suddenly, they heard a loud crash. A truck slammed on its brakes because of a child in the road and began tipping toward the boy. Rachel, however, ripped a lamppost out of the plaza and hurled it at the vehicle. With that, she managed to pin the cargo section against the bridge above. However, that solution would not hold it for long. Rachel then rushed forward to support the entire truck by herself, but Saki immediately told Apple to go help her. She then grabbed her laptop to finally put her hacking skills to proper use. She locked all the nearby traffic lights, preventing other vehicles from approaching. Rachel was having considerable difficulty supporting the weight of the truck. However, with Eppen's help, she managed to keep holding it up. Naturally, the incident became breaking news. A truck had overturned in the city center after one of its tires blew out. Fortunately, thanks to the intervention of several tourists, no one was injured. The secretary of the heroine Lancelot recognized the girls who had caused a commotion in the lobby while trying to find her. She then asked whether she should call them in, although Ellie did not seem particularly interested. She agreed and scheduled a time. The next morning, Kang Jioma, Abel, and Shiley arrived at the Rank D Undead Dungeon, stopping in front of a cave. Shire remarked that she had checked the location several times to make sure they had not come to the wrong address. Kang Jioma wondered whether this really had the atmosphere of a Rank D dungeon. Compared to that place, even the Buffalo Dungeon seemed like a genuine palace. Near the entrance stood something resembling an obelisk, a stone covered in inscriptions and numerous slash marks. Kang Jioma could not even identify what language it was written in. Shiley explained that they were probably runes. She had studied them a little at the academy, but she still could not interpret everything accurately. The upper section had been deliberately destroyed, probably with a sword. Even so, she could decipher some passages from the lower section, though she could not guarantee complete accuracy. After concentrating, she began reading what was written there. Those who grant peace to the dead shall be crowned by the king of the dead. Kang Jioma immediately thought that it must be referring to the Draugr. She then explained that this was everything she had managed to uncover. The remaining parts were beyond her ability to interpret. She apologized for being unable to do more. Kang Jioma, however, replied that this was already far more than he had expected. Finally, they entered the dungeon and soon began hearing strange noises echoing through the cave walls. Amid the silence, distant screams occasionally rose from the depths. It was easy to understand why everyone avoided such a frightening place. Shortly afterward, several zombies surrounded them. Shire said that she could handle them. Abel reminded her that this would be a battle of endurance. Once she grew tired, she would leave the work to Shire, so it would be better for her to conserve her energy for now. Abel focused, trying to remind herself that those creatures were no longer truly human. Then, using the blessing of the snowflower, she defeated all the zombies at once. Afterward, she quietly wished that they could finally rest in peace. Kang Jioma was surprised. In the game, he did not remember Abel being this powerful. Perhaps she had developed faster after reaching first place in the class. After several more appeared, the group continued advancing deeper into the cave. Kang Jioma asked why Abel always concentrated and asked for forgiveness before facing each zombie. She explained that although they were monsters now, every one of them had once been human. No one knew exactly why. However, this was the only place where people entered and ended up transforming into walking corpses. To her, the real problem lay within that dungeon. Abel believed that something remained hidden there. Kang Jioma realized that she was right, and he knew that what remained hidden there was the Draugr. Abel then wondered whether it was strange that the undead were classified as demonic beasts. After all, they were not demons and seemed to be given that name simply because they were no longer human. She also asked whether he had ever seen any news about those creatures attacking anyone outside the dungeon. The answer was obvious. There were no such cases. Even so, the Hero Association classified them as dangerous, which easily explained why so many people felt uncomfortable visiting that dungeon. To Abel, however, calling them beasts was wrong. They remained there for some reason, although confronting them was unavoidable for her. At the very least, she wished for them to depart in peace. She was a swordswoman who blended compassion with remarkable resolve. Her true nature was beginning to show. Abel apologized for talking too much, and the group continued onward. She kept asking for forgiveness before confronting each zombie, though she defeated them with astonishing ease. Kang Jioma began to find it strange. The zombies were far too slow for this to be considered an ambush, and they did not even seem genuinely interested in attacking. They merely advanced with their arms outstretched. This was not an ordinary battle, but a confrontation of attrition and endurance. Then, Kang Jioma activated the blessing of the sword god, expanding his perception to sense everything around him. It would be better to find the correct path quickly, even if he had to expend some energy. His perception reached much farther and became considerably sharper. Perhaps now he could even locate the Draugr. However, while examining the path, he noticed a person waving at him. Kang Jioma told the others that he had found a person, or at least something that looked very much like one. It was farther ahead, so everyone headed in that direction. They found a zombie that truly looked remarkably human. The creature recoiled from the light, but before the others could react, something happened. Kang Jioma had already moved forward to confront the creature. Meanwhile, Saki learned from that heroine that Kang Jioma had never been to New York. Speed Weapon asked about all those articles. She explained that the press had simply made everything up, meaning they were basically fake news. Rachel was laughing at her, so Saki asked what was so funny. She replied that it was nothing serious. She was simply quite disappointed that they had not found what they were looking for. The heroine apologized for being unable to help her juniors who had traveled from so far away. Then, she asked Rachel's name. Upon realizing that she belonged to the Spear Saints family, she wanted to know what her plans were after graduation. Rachel said she would have a better answer if her love life were going as well as Saki's, but lately she had been dealing with some problems. Then, the other woman asked whether she had any interest in pursuing a career as a heroine. Rachel said she was not very interested and that her uncle would lose his mind. Saki joked that a heroine outfit would suit her, while Speed Weapon urged them to think carefully before turning that idiot into a heroine. Even so, Rachel admitted that helping people that way had been fun. On the way back, Saki was already prepared to return to the academy. Before leaving, she asked the two of them not to hide anything from her. After all, they would soon meet again at the academy. As she made her way back, she remarked to herself that it had been a little embarrassing. Even so, she kept wondering why Rachel had laughed earlier. She decided to let it go for now and ask her once she returned to the academy. And that's all for today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and check out the membership club. Also stay tuned because some videos will have goals to unlock other series, including this one. If you want a new part of mercenary Cecil Perdium, who became lord of his own territory, the editor can show that video's thumbnail on the screen. Those who want a continuation already know what to do. The goal is 6,000 likes on this video here, not that other one. Understood. And that's it. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Take care, and see you next time.